Hey everyone, welcome to Firescale Audiobooks. If you enjoy the audiobooks, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. If you'd like to support us further, consider becoming a Patreon member. As a member, you'll gain the ability to request the next part of a novel audiobook I've uploaded, depending on your Patreon tier.
We are looking at a world very similar to Earth. In the year 21XX, humanity realized that they were done for. They had missed the mark and were facing inevitable climate change. More and more natural disasters plagued humanity. Storms raged, cities were flooded, and the people became desperate. Projects were rushed, solutions were searched. Catastrophes brought things to light that should have better stayed in the dark. But it was no movie and no novel. There was no way for them to stop it. Everything kept spiraling out of control, escalating up to the breaking point. Smack. Drowsily, he lifted his head after smacking his alarm clock to the other side of the room, where it was still ringing. God damn it. Squinting at the clock, he rolled off the bed and crawled over to turn it off. Seth had been burning the midnight fuel playing games the night before and forgot to turn off his alarm. Bright light fell in through half-closed shutters of the window and burned on his pale skin. Since when was the light in the city so bright? Seth lived at B City, a medium-sized city at the southeastern corner of the continent. On a normal day, the light should be a refreshing yellowish-gray, thanks to the invigorating smoke of civilization. So, what was up with these disgustingly bright rays of sunlight? Shielding his bluish-gray eyes with his hands, the youth picked himself up and went towards the window. Brushing his dark hair out of his eyes, he blinked. Then he blinked again. Well, that's weird. He grabbed his phone. Yep, only slept for a few hours. Then why the flip was the city overgrown like a forest? The panorama of the city he had seen and known for almost all his life was tinted with overwhelming green. Streets were covered in tall grass like a savanna. Trees had broken through the constraints of concrete and structures. Houses and buildings had been pierced, some actually collapsed because of trees that had skewered them. And almost every vertical surface seemed to have been covered in vines. His phone had no reception, and his internet connection was cut off. Seth pursed the lips. Something was going on. Well, anyone who wasn't blind could see that. At this moment, a voice rang in his head and scenes started to play before his eyes like a cinematic trailer.
Ding.
Welcome to the post-apocalypse, player. Your world, as you knew it, came to an end. Tragedies and calamities have hit Earth and changed the face of the planet forever. You are now responsible for your survival. You are the master of your fate. Whether you die in this foreign world or become the master of your own fate is all up to you. He actually knew many of the scenes that were shown on the news. Natural disasters that had been hitting the continent the last few years. But there were some he didn't know. Scenes of a destroyed laboratory. Weird lines of code reminding him of a famous science fiction movie. Dark fiery holes opening in midair and glimpses of caves and ever-growing darkness. Would you like to start the tutorial? Y/N. This sentence was energetically floating in front of him like an early text animation. The letters were thick, golden, and kept spinning in order. Seth was reminded of old flashy retro games. They kept spinning in the center of his view, no matter where he looked. Sure, why not, he said to himself and clicked Y. Seth had no idea what exactly was going on, but a tutorial sounded like a good start to find out. Good choice. Only 12% of all players have made the same choice. His vision became blurry and his surroundings changed into a dark void. Like the copy of a game tutorial, the system started to explain how to use things like quest dash, status dash, skill, and inventory window, which could be opened by thinking or reciting the names. It also mentioned that most skills he could obtain would be self-explanatory when he concentrated on them. His status looked something like this. Name, Seth Smith. Level 1. XP, 0%. Race, Orihuma. Sex, male. Age, 23. Class, none. Affiliation, none. Health, 1000. Mana, 100. Strength, 9. Dexterity, 12. Agility, 12. Intelligence, 10. Willpower, 10. Endurance 11. Personality 7. Luck 14. Free AP. Attribute points 10. He had no skills or quests yet, so the skill window was empty. Similarly, the inventory window only showed what he was currently wearing and a field of 3 by 3, so 9 item slots to store his items in. As Seth had expected, he could collect experience to level up. Each level up would grant 5 to 10 free AP. And about gathering experience. There are a great many ways to collect experience on your journey. Whether it's quests or achievements, and of course, by killing, the system said ominously, and a sword appeared in front of him. It was a plain arming sword with some rust and a scratched-up blade. Take hold of this weapon and make your first step of many in this new world. Take your life in your own hands, or die. With this, a small ugly humanoid appeared in the void in front of him. Is that a goblin? Seriously? What a cliché. Seth grasped the sword and noticed surprised that even so it looked beat up and plain, the sword seemed well balanced and felt good in his hand. The moment he gripped the sword in his hand, the green creature charged at him with an unnerving screech. It rang in his tired head and really annoyed him. His body moved, using the sword like a club, trying to direct the sharp side towards the creature and hack down in its shoulder. The sword went halfway through its rib cage, almost splitting it in two.
Ding.
Skill. Basic swordsmanship. Beginner. LV1 has been learned.
Ding.
Title. Faster than the thought acquired. Your body moved before your brain reacted.
Ding.
Passive skill. Calm reaction. LV1 acquired, thanks to title. Faster than the thought. Seth felt everything traveling up the hilt of the sword, cutting its meager wiry frame and tough flesh, the edge crushing and splitting apart its bones under his hand. It was all real. He was looking on in shock as its dark, smelly blood splashed everywhere and the goblin collapsed at his feet. Until now, he was half convinced that it was some weird but really cool dream. He scratched his scraggly beard, trying to think of what to do now. But his thoughts were interrupted by the system.
Ding.
You have killed Goblin LV1. You have earned experience.
Ding.
Congratulations on your first kill. You mercilessly struck down the hideous creature in a single cold-blooded strike. Only 0.5% of other players have made this choice. Special reward. Silver class wheel. What's a silver class wheel? He asked subconsciously. Good question, player. Great transition. Let's go ahead and continue with the last lesson, your class choice. Each player can choose a basic class from this list. A golden scroll appeared with a number of classes like swordsman, warrior, fighter, healer, pharmacist, mage, things like that. A class offers you the set of skills connected to it and a boost in learning them, but do not worry. It does not limit the skills you can learn. Any skill can be learned with effort, no matter what class you choose. Just how you acquired swordsmanship by swinging a sword, a white wheel filled with question marks appeared beside the scroll. Now you could choose one of these basic classes, but you could also spin the class wheel and get a random class that could be anything between basic and outright mythical. But you will have to take that class, no matter what. Seth could hear sneer in the system's voice. There were probably a lot of people who did this and got something like cook or baker. Nothing against those classes, but crafting wasn't really the first choice in a survival situation. He definitely wouldn't take the chance and risk a silver wheel appeared beside the white one. In your case, you can also spin the silver wheel. Only classes above advanced are on this wheel. You could be a legendary dragon knight, a hero, maybe a demon lord, a necromancer who raises the dead to fight for him, or a sage with unimaginable destructive magic. Seth sighed and rubbed his eyes. I'm really too tired for this sh*t. We both know where this is going, just spin the silver thing already. At this point, he just wanted this to end, so he could sort his thoughts. Seth didn't know the situation outside. He had no idea what class was good. But it wasn't necessarily important, since any skill could be learned, no matter the class. An advanced or above class should be an advantage, no matter what things turned out to be. He watched the wheel spin slowly, losing speed. Yeah, he just thought that it didn't matter as much what class he got, but his face still fell when the wheel stopped and revealed the symbol of an anvil and hammer burning with an eerie blue flame. Congratulations! Unique class, Spirit Blacksmith, has been chosen. Was this system messing with him? Was it really random, or did it just give him a class fitting his name?
Ding.
5+ new skills have been learned. Please check your skill window.
Ding.
You are the second person to acquire a unique or above class from a job wheel. Title, Lucky Bastard, has been acquired. Title effect, Luck +1. The black void started to blur, and his room came back into view. You have successfully completed the tutorial. With this, you are ready to grasp your fate. Good luck. You have been granted experience for finishing the tutorial. Seth took a deep breath and fell on his bed. He savored the quiet and thought. It slowly started settling in that the life he knew was over. But it didn't hit him as hard as he thought. Was it because there wasn't really anyone he cared about anymore? Or maybe, skill window? The window opened in front of his eyes. The formerly empty list was filled with a whole slew of new skills. Calm reaction, passive, LV1. Strong mental shocks or surprises are mitigated, and the emotional processing is later spread over a span of time to help deal with unexpected situations. That's about what I thought. Okay, it actually seems quite handy. Then his eyes fell on the list of other skills he got from his class. There were obviously skills associated with a blacksmith like smelting, beginner, LV1. Extraction of pure metals from raw materials and creation of alloys in a furnace. Blacksmith SI's LV1. Appraisal of gear and materials up to uncommon. Creates a catalog of all discovered materials and saves their properties. Blueprint, beginner, LV1. Create and save blueprints and material lists in the system overlay. Blacksmith, beginner, LV1. Forge and shape metal in the smithy with the help of your forge, tools, and an anvil. Create armor and weapons from crafting materials. He noticed that his swordsmanship had vanished. Instead, had it gotten weapon mastery? Weapon mastery, beginner, LV1. You are a natural in handling weapons and can deliver a good fight no matter what weapon you use. A slight increase in damage when using a weapon. Except for this one, they seemed quite common for what a blacksmith should have. On the other hand, it was understandable that a blacksmith should know how to handle his products. But a lot more interesting were the class-specific skills. Spirit Smithy LV1. You can summon the Spirit Smithy. The smithy encompasses advanced crafting stations and increases the crafting speed corresponding to the user's blacksmith skill. Spirit Capture LV1. You are able to see and capture souls of recently deceased beings to use as crafting materials. The second one would need him to kill something or find a fresh corpse. It seemed a little dangerous to test, but Spirit Smithy. He jumped off his bed and went to his small living room. Everything still seemed normal. He looked out the window and spotted others doing the same from the buildings near his apartment and across the street. He closed the shutters and invoked the skill. Summoning failed. Not enough space to invoke skill. First time someone called my living room small. Seth actually lived in a quite big masonette apartment that was left behind by his parents. Was his furniture in the way? He rubbed his hands and started to push the couch, the table, and other things that were probably blocking the skill away. Sometime later, he had cleared his living room, which left him with almost 15 square meters of empty space, 2 stories in height. When his stomach started rumbling, he remembered that he hadn't eaten anything yet. He went to scavenge the kitchen for edibles. Seth hadn't really expected the world to end, so his food storage looked quite meager. But hey, at least water and power were still working, so the grid had not broken down yet. Bread, some fruits, meat, really old canned food, a frozen pizza, a few bottles of water and soda, and packs of noodles. This reminded Seth that preparation canned tea hurt. Looking around his apartment, filled with empty plastic bottles he had no chance to bring away yet. He went ahead and filled them all up with water. Who knew when it would stop working? Seth realized that he had to leave the apartment eventually to get food, but he definitely wouldn't just leave his home without more preparations. He could definitely stay holed up for a few days with this if he rationed it well. The meticulous rationing started by throwing the pizza in the oven for breakfast and gobbling up the whole thing. A productive day started with a greasy breakfast. After filling his stomach, he first went and made sure that his door was locked and checked the situation in the hallway using the peephole. No blood smeared across the walls. No mangled corpses covering the floor. Just a clean, normal hallway. He didn't know whether he should feel reassured or disappointed. Novels with these kinds of scenarios suggested that there were bloodbaths everywhere, but it didn't seem like marauding monsters had started slaughtering innocent people yet. So he probably still had some time before he would have to join the mob and be part of the mandatory pillaging for food and resources. If he was to leave his apartment, he had to familiarize himself with the system and his class first. This unique class was his only advantage, so he had to use it well.
Ding.
You have been given the quest, the next level. After making sure that he didn't have to expect to be raided any time soon, he returned to the kitchen. His fingers were itching to retry summoning the smithy, but he got the idea to test out the system, which seemed more important for now. Seth wanted to test the inventory. He took what little food reserves he had and tried putting them into the inventory slots, starting with the refilled water bottles. He remembered the instructions from the tutorial and concentrated on storing the bottle he held in his hand. It vanished, and instead the icon of a generic water bottle appeared in his inventory. When he looked at it, a little window opened stating "bottle of clean water," similar to when you hovered the mouse of an item in a video game. Next, he tried the same with an empty bottle, which was fittingly labeled as "empty bottle." He thought about taking it out, and the empty bottle appeared back in his hand. But it wasn't actually the bottle he had. It was an empty plastic bottle that fit the generic icon that was shown in the item slot, not the soda bottle he had stored. He took out the refilled water bottle. It had also changed. It was exactly the same as the empty bottle, just filled with water. He took one of the regular water bottles and did the same, and the same happened. It changed into the same featureless plastic bottle that fit the generic icon in the inventory. Just as he expected, when he stored those filled bottles that had changed again, they stacked in the same slot. Seth conjectured that the inventory would generalize all items he stored, so they could be stacked if they had no defining features. He tested it with the noodles and canned food, and they all lost their label and specific packaging. The system only divided by content. The packaging became the same. Seth wanted to try other things next. When he grabbed a knife to see whether it would appear in the weapon slot, it actually did, and it stated, "Knife LV1 can be appraised with blacksmith SIs. A chance to test the skill." Looking at a kitchen knife, he concentrated on the skill. He felt a cool sensation entering his eyes, and it gave him a small window.
Knife. Common.
Damage, 1-3. Durability, 10 out of 10. A mass-produced sharp knife, for cooking purposes. Has a low chance to cause bleeding. This was the same for most knives he found, except for the damage being even lower. He tried the skill on other kitchen utensils, which declared them as crafting materials for smelting. Most of his kitchenware was declared as made of low-quality iron. Materials for smelting. Should he try to summon the smithy now and see what he could get from smelting his cutlery, pans, and pots? Seth decided it was time. His handy itched to try more skills and start grinding his glass. He stood in his empty living room and concentrated on the Spirit Smithy skill. Spirit Smithy LV1 summoned. What filled his living room now was a basic blacksmith shop. The knowledge of what he was looking at and how it was supposed to be used was floating into Seth's mind. It was part of the different skills like Spirit Smithy and Blacksmith. Everything looked incorporeal and transparent, shining in a pale blue. A ghostly white flame was burning in a stereotypic-looking coal forge that stood in the very center, and a medium-sized dark blue anvil beside it. He tried using Blacksmith SIs on it. Spirit Forge, crafting station. Burning with soul fire, the Spirit Forge can be used to work all common materials used for forging. Increases crafting speed by 50%. He looked to the right where a work table and a grinding wheel stood. A few tools like hammers and tongs were lying on the table, and it had a vise. They were labeled as common and increased the success rate of forging by 5 to 10%. The wheel looked ordinary, but a window opened. Sisyphus, grinding wheel, crafting station. Part of the boulder Sisyphus is pushing. It will never stop turning while in use. Grind, sharpen, and shape any common crafting materials. Increases crafting speed by 50%. soul fire in the forge, and a grinding wheel named after Sisyphus. This forge seemed very underworld-themed. But the barrel of water to quench the blade had no funny descriptions like water of the Styx at all. He looked to the left of the forge and saw a cylindrical furnace, made of dark, thick bricks. It was burning with the same ghostly flame, and an assortment of crucibles and casting molds for crude metal bars lay beside it. Spirit Furnace, Crafting Station. Burning with soul fire, the spirit furnace can be used to melt down and refine common materials used for forging. Increases crafting speed by 50%. Reading the descriptions, Seth realized that they were restricted to common materials. Was it because it was still level 1? Well, it wasn't like he had a lot of uncommon materials to work with. At least Seth guessed that iron wouldn't count as uncommon. He ran his hands over the rows of tools on the work table. When he grasped a hammer, a window with 3 options opened. Crafting. Choose a blueprint. Create a blueprint. Free creation. He could guess what they were. When he clicked them one after the other, he was proven correct. Choose a blueprint was a list of blueprints for weapons and armors which consisted of instructions and receipts. When he clicked the blueprint of a small dagger, he could actually feel minimal guidance. He was sure that if he now started forging, the system would guide him to increase the chances of successfully making the weapon. Create a blueprint activated blueprinting, which was similar to a guided 3D modeling program where he could design a weapon. Free creation just closed the window and left him to his own devices. His conviction grew. He could summon a forge wherever he was and make weapons and armor whenever he wanted. This class would be the edge he had in this world. And he knew exactly what he had to do to succeed in it. Grinding. Seth knew that he would have to leave to get more food and stuff at some point, but right now he had food for a few days, so he planned to raise his skills for as long as possible and then try to make a weapon and some armor before leaving his secure home. Using blacksmith's eyes, he combed through his home to find any and everything he could throw in the furnace and collected them on a pile in the living room. Cutlery, pots, pans, except for some necessities, his kitchen was emptied. A wall hanger sword, stainless steel lamps. His toolbox was plundered, too. Seth even found some packets of screws. When he was done, it looked like a dragon had built a nest in his living room, made from almost anything shiny he owned. Anything he could throw into the furnace. On the other side was a heap of other crafting materials he had found while looking around. Leather and wood from furniture, clothes, buckles, belts, and straps. From the blueprints, he knew that these things were mostly needed for armors or as a handle material. He rubbed his hand as he stepped towards the furnace. The inside was smooth like porcelain, and its bottom, where the ghostly flame would be burning, was bowl-shaped with a small drain. With that, he could drain the molten metal into a crucible or directly into the mold for ingots. Before he started smelting, he tried to use an exploit. Seth put all the cutlery into his inventory to turn them into uniform knives. He hoped to maybe gain some material from putting in the smaller things. Unfortunately, the system only changed their shape to make them look the same from a 2-dimensional view. They still had the same mass as before. On the other hand, some of the uniform cutlery were thicker or thinner. He was a little disappointed, but it couldn't be helped. Seth continued to throw a handful into the furnace. Next, smelting, beginner, LV.1 opened as a window with something similar to a control panel for the furnace. It had a list of options to choose what should be refined from the material. Right now, there was only one entry. Well, he hoped there would be more options in the future. At the moment, it was only low-quality iron, and it even had a success rate of just 75% stated beside it. What would happen if he failed? Would everything be gone? It was not really of any use to guess. He went ahead and confirmed. He confirmed his choice, and a kind of mini-game started on the control panel. Seth had to manually adjust the parameters like the strength of the flames and their distribution to change, and stabilize the temperature in the furnace according to the system's indications. One thing to note was that the soul fire needed no fuel and created no smoke. The white flames flared up and easily melted down the cutlery in less than a minute. Seth lost focus for a moment, and smelting failed. Proficiency gained. His first try was a fail. Seth watched as the flames burned up about 1/4 of the molten metal. Well, at least the system didn't destroy all of it. Seth used the drain to harvest the leftover metal. It was the first time he felt the immense heat the metal gave off. It didn't affect him as much as he would have expected, probably thanks to the 50% fire resistance that was granted by his class. Using a crucible, he caught the liquid metal and poured it into a casting mold. Seth fetched some water from the barrel to help cool it off. The resulting ingot was a cuboid chunk of metal that lay good in his hand and were a little longer than the width of his palm. He felt a little down because of the failed attempt, but soon a smile appeared on his face. When Seth checked the skill window, he saw that the proficiency of smelting actually went up despite failing. He now had smelting beginner LV.14%. He still had a lot of stuff to melt down. At this pace, he would be able to level the skill quite a bit. Another happy surprise struck him when he continued. The success rate had increased to 76%. The next smelting succeeded and actually gave him 9%. If it kept going like this, he would be the master of low-quality iron before lunchtime. But he had crowed too early. By the time smelting reached level 3, the success rate had stopped at 99%, so he still had a chance to fail. Level 3 also unlocked the option to refine mediocre iron. He had not expected this. Seth's original plan was to smelt down everything to level smelting, then forge stuff from it to leveled blacksmith and smelt them down again. He wanted to repeat that circle a few times, but now a new question came up. Did the material influence the proficiency he would gain for blacksmith? On one hand, mediocre iron started with only a success rate of 60%, but it gave almost 3 times the experience for smelting. On the other hand, he would probably lose a lot more material he could use to level up blacksmith. So all he could do now was trying out the materials. He took an ingot of low-quality iron. Holding the small bar of metal in his hands made him realize once again how real this was. Seth went to the forge. As a blueprint, he chose a small throwing dagger because the only material it needed was metal of any kind. After confirming the blueprint, he could feel the guidance from the system as impulses and knowledge to do specific things flooded his head. He took tongs and a hammer, put the iron into the eerie flame of the forge, and waited. When the iron was glowing in a kind of cherry red, he picked it up with the tongs and started shaping it on the anvil with the hammer. Feeling the heat in the smithy, the impact of the hammer, the hot metal giving under his power, his muscles being strained. The situation felt so unreal, but it also felt good. After some time of clumsily following the guidance and quenching the blade, he finished it off by grinding it, and a message popped up.
Ding.
You finished your first work as a blacksmith. Strength +1. Dexterity +1. Seth appraised his first work. Misshapen throwing knife.
Common.
Damage 1 to 2. Durability 2 of 2. The first work of an aspiring blacksmith. This piece has the barely discernible shape of a throwing knife. It may hurt a little if you manage to hit someone with it. Seth knew that it didn't look very good. Okay. No need to be this harsh. It was definitely fit to be melted down again. But that wasn't the point. He had gained 15% proficiency in blacksmith. Now he went ahead and tried again with the mediocre iron. The result was the same. It had a little more durability and damage, but he still only gained 15%, bringing him to blacksmith beginner, LV1 30%. To make sure, he tried some other small blueprints. Forging took a lot longer than smelting, so it took until noon to make sure. It was still a lot faster than forging without his class and smithy. Seth fathomed it would take a lot longer without it. He had gained some more proficiency, bringing his skill to LV2, 45%, when he finished. The experience he gained in blacksmith mostly came from the difficulty of the product, not the material used. At least not in this case. There was also another thing Seth found out. The amount of experience gained also depended on the finished product. A fail would give him very little progress, while a good result could significantly increase the proficiency. He didn't know by how much, since all his stuff was still no better than scrap. Smelting was actually similar but different. A fail gave him less than half the proficiency than a success. It was only those two. It didn't have a gradation like blacksmith. Now he had to decide which to level first, blacksmith or smelting? If he went for mediocre iron to level smelting, he might lose a lot of material he could use to level blacksmith. He valued the latter more, so he decided to turn all the stuff left into low-quality iron and go for mediocre iron when resmelting. But first came lunch. Rationing with an iron fist, he decided to fill his belly with noodles. After this little pause, Seth continued to melt down everything he had into metal ingots, still bringing his skill to smelting beginner, LV4, 30%. The day was peaceful, and he was completely focused on bringing up his blacksmith proficiency. Forging, quenching, grinding, over and over. Before Seth realized it, the sun was already about to set. Sweaty and tired, he looked out the window and the scenery in the fading daylight. Beside him was a pile of finished throwing knives. He had actually managed to process all the low-quality iron he had into knives in the last several hours. He had managed to raise his skill to blacksmith beginner, LV5, 7%, and while the knives were still garbage, they looked a lot better. Even so, the experience gain fell with the level up. He also became faster in making the items. Looking at the setting sun, he finally registered how tired he actually was. Still, he collected all the metal dust he ground off the knives, the broken parts of failed knives, and the pile of finished knives towards the furnace, and spent another hour turning it all into mediocre iron, leveling his smelting up to LV6 and close to LV7. It was dark outside, and he could barely keep his eyes open. Seth wobbled toward his room and fell on his bed. Maybe I should have checked, he thought, but fell asleep. Seth woke up with his body aching all over. He had been too focused on leveling his skills that he hadn't noticed his body's pains. Status. Name: Seth Smith. Title: Faster Than the Thought. Level 1. EXP: 60%. Race: Orihuma. Sex: male. Age: 23. Class: Spirit Blacksmith Unique. Affiliation: none. Health: 975/1000. Mana 100 INTX 10. Strength 11. Dexterity 15. Agility 12. Intelligence 10. Willpower 10. Endurance 13. Personality 7. Luck 15. Free AP. Attribute points 10. Defense. Physical 89. ENDX 3 plus 50 class bonus. Magical 45, 2 XWIL plus 25 class bonus. Fire resistance 50%. Skill window. Calm reaction. Passive LV1. Blacksmith beginner LV5 8%. Blacksmith SIs LV1. Smelting beginner LV6 75%. Blueprint beginner LV2. Weapon mastery beginner LV1. Spirit smithy LV1. Spirit capture LV1. Had some of his attributes increased? Oh yeah. Some memories floated up. He had ignored the notifications at that time. Something about attribute +1 thanks to intense training. Wait, why had his HP decreased? His sore muscles screamed as he got off his bed. Oh, maybe that's why. His slow thought remembered the tutorial. It explained that the HP showed the whole health, not just obvious injuries. That's why there are a lot from the start. Why was he even awake? It was still dark outside. As tired as he was, he should have slept until noon. Seth squinted into the direction of his alarm clock, but it lay dead in the corner of the room. My first victim of the apocalypse. A gruesome murder scene of broken parts and limp hands. His wandering thoughts were interrupted by noises outside on the street. He had been too occupied yesterday, and the outside was very quiet. Seth had forgotten to check whether other people had the guts to leave their homes and run around outside. Maybe he should at least check his neighbors? He looked around for his smartphone, which told him that it was 4 a.m. Who would be so crazy to go out at this time? Seth tottered to his bedroom window and looked outside. He could barely see the contours of the same scene from yesterday, a city widely overgrown by nature. A shiver ran down his spine as he looked at the familiar, unfamiliar scenery. He listened attentively. He heard grunts and growling calls of deep voices speaking in a foreign language. Concentrating on where the sounds came from, he could make out the shapes of creatures walking through the high grass. He estimated the high grass to be about 1.5 m tall, and it barely reached the giant's hips. They would easily tower above 3 m in height, and they looked almost as wide. Earlier they sounded aggressive and motivated. It reminded him of a band of brothers in war movies. But something had changed. They suddenly became hectic, and their calls sounded more anxious and hurried. They made a beeline towards a building as it happened. Seth saw as they started vanishing. The first was silent, and then started the screams when they realized what was happening to them. Now he was wide awake, and his heart turned cold. Rumbling and hysteric screams echoed between the canyons of concrete and steel. A shiver ran down his spine. He watched as all the leftover figures started running, but it didn't save them. They, too, vanished into the high grass as if the earth itself had swallowed them. What could make something of that size disappear in a moment? Seth retreated from the window and sat on the ground holding his head. The system had shown him pictures of portals, so he had expected foreign creatures to appear. But what kind of creature came through that could just hunt things like these ogre-sized creatures? He took a few deep breaths to calm down. Whatever it was outside. He was safe for now, as long as he didn't leave, maybe. It's not like he could do anything about it for now. He cast a last glance outside the window where everything was quiet again and went into the kitchen after calming down. A productive day starts with a greasy meal. He fried the meat he had left with some noodles left from yesterday and filled his stomach to the brim. Living the rationing life. It seemed that the system really boosted the recovery of fatigue, since he felt quite refreshed after just a few hours of sleep and a hearty meal. This felt almost like a healing factor. Seth laughed to himself. He checked, and it was still dark outside. Should he start forging? Or should he check on his neighbors? It wouldn't hurt. Maybe they even knew something important? It was just going down the hallway, but he decided not to leave his home unprepared. Who knew what could happen? He stuffed all the iron he had made yesterday into his inventory, together with his water and food. Seth equipped himself with the best gear he had found so far. A thick leather jacket that increased his defense by a little, sturdy leather boots, and the cane of his grandfather. Seth hadn't really expected this, but do not underestimate a walking stick. Blacksmith's eyes told him it was his best weapon. Old cane.
Common.
Damage, 10 to 17. Durability, 22 of 25. An old strolling stick made of a sturdy piece of oak fitted with a heavy brass knob. Can cause stagger and knockout with a critical hit. All geared up, he first probed the situation in the hallways with the peephole. Still, no blood and gore covering the white walls of the hallway or the tiles of the floor. As he opened the door and wanted to step out, a message popped up in front of him. You are about to leave the safe zone. Once you have left the safe zone, it will dissolve and you cannot return. Are you sure you wish to leave the safe zone? Y/N. Seth hesitated. Nope. He chose N and stepped back into his apartment. It wasn't really that important to check on his neighbors now, right?
Yeah.
He was still good on food and water anyway. Seth totally lacked the preparation he wanted. Before he left, guaranteed safety behind once and for all. He put the jacket and the cane beside the door and went back to the living room where he summoned the spirit smithy. Grinding it was. Time to turn this mediocre iron into knives. He would use the arduous work to push those unsettling thoughts aside. After making dozens of knives and small stuff like arrowheads yesterday, Seth felt ready to try the free creation. He wanted to see the difference and how far he could go without the direct help of the system. He followed the same steps and movements that were already ingrained into him yesterday. He started with making a throwing knife. It was harder to estimate the temperature, and he often missed the right spots when forging the iron. But this actually felt better. It was him, Seth, creating something without outside help. He also got a much better feeling of where to hit and how strong. Working like this for the first time ignited a flame in his heart. He had still felt a little conflicted about getting a crafting class until now, but now Seth felt a passion growing within him. He really wanted to grow his class and skills, not just for survival. After managing to forge the rough shape and quenching it successfully in the barrel, Seth ground it into a sharp knife barely resembling the throwing knife from the blueprint.
Ding.
You have successfully created an item without guidance. Dex +1. Surprised by the announcement, he checked the knife with his blacksmith's eyes, but it was nothing out of the ordinary. It was a little worse than the last ones he did with the system's help. Low quality, throwing knife.
Common.
Damage, 2 to 4. Durability, 5 out of 5. A recognizable throwing knife by an aspiring blacksmith. When you throw it, you might even hurt someone else but yourself. Still a lot better than his first try with the system. And he did it all alone. The real surprise hit Seth when he checked his skills. He had actually gained a lot more proficiency for this throwing knife. It was almost double as much as for the ones he made with blueprints. Time went by as he tried doing the other weapons he had tried, like arrowheads and daggers. No matter what he made, free creation gave him double the points on average. This was great, considering that the skill needed more and more experience to level up. Seth decided to choose a more complex blueprint now. He would use the blueprint to get a feeling for the process, and then try doing it in free creation. Seth chose a long hunting knife. It had a long blade and looked similar to a Bowie knife. It was more complicated and had more parts he needed to make. The blade, a handguard, a pommel, and a wooden handle. It was a lot more exhausting than the simple thing he did before, even with the guidance. In the end, after several hours of work, he failed twice out of 3 attempts. But Seth still gained huge amounts of proficiency. He had leveled straight up to LV6 in one go. Plopping down on a chair that had survived his material gathering, Seth took out a water bottle from the inventory and started drinking in big gulps. He choked when he looked out the window. The outside was still immersed in the twilight. He looked at his phone, 12 p.m. What was going on? It was already noon and still dark outside? Was this also an apocalyptic scenario? Did the sun go on a strike and didn't wish to work today? Looking out the windows, he saw the city submerged in the twilight. He opened the window and leaned outside to look at the sky. What the, he muttered when he saw why there was no light. It wasn't the sun unwilling to work. It was the canopy of a gargantuan tree that was covering the sky above the city and blocking out the light. The tree even outclassed the skyscrapers in the city center. It looked like an oak with half a dozen thick main branches reaching across the city's sky and almost touching the ground some kilometers away. It was like a dome encompassing almost half the city. When did this even grow? Looking up to the branch that kept splitting off the main one, Seth saw something dangling. Oh fuck! His eyes widened and his heart sunk. He had found the giant creature from last night. The oak's branches were covered in vines, and on the vines, hung like criminals on the gallows, were desiccated corpses. Not just the hulking creatures, but also corpses from other humanoids like the goblin he had seen, and humans. How did those end up there? Seth pulled out the binoculars of his father, he had found yesterday among his stuff. As if covered in fairy lights, the branches of the tree were filled with vines holding dried-up bodies in colorful casual clothes. Some of them wore jackets and backpacks. Had they left the safe zones and tried to get out? Looking with the binoculars, he saw that they were not actually hanging like hanged, but the vines were penetrating and growing through the bodies. He could also see small glowing orbs beside the dead. Soul, tiny, crafting material. Common. It was Spirit Capture LV.1 jumping into action. But wait, didn't it say he could only see the souls of recently deceased bodies? Did this mean that these bodies up there were only recently turned into these mummies? His blood turned cold. Had so many things happened while he tried to grind out an advantage?
Ding.
You have witnessed the terror of Field Boss, the hanging tree. Experience gained. The world was really moving fast now. A field boss had spawned? Seth felt like he had to act, so he wasn't left behind. Looking between the forge and the window, he hesitated. He had wanted to take the safe route and grind as much as he could without leaving safety. But judging from the corpses on the tree, he might not be safe if he stayed for much longer. He didn't have the time. Instead of following his original plan and grinding the hunting knife, he decided to shoot for gear to go outside. Sounds from outside interrupted his thinking. Looks like I wasn't the only one who noticed the changes. He leaned out the window again. Looking down at the street, he saw a group of 3 wading through the high grass on the street below. They also wore backpacks, and in their hands they actually held weapons. The guys in the front had a sword and a mace, and the girl behind them had a staff. Did they get starter gear for their classes? When he looked with the binoculars, they looked very young, maybe a group of schoolmates. They had started shouting. Seth knew this scene, but he could actually see more in the current twilight than during the night. The big guy with the mace had his mouth suddenly covered by an agile vine that shot up from the high grass around them. It pulled him down to the ground without him being able to make a sound. His teammates turned around, but there was only a trail in the grass where he was pulled away along the ground. They couldn't, but Seth could see what happened then. The trail vanished in a narrow alley, but looking up, Seth saw the silhouette of the body rising towards the branches above, to find its place among the others up there. The vine had actually entered his mouth, penetrated his head, and exited from his eye. Seth could see the soul appearing. Mace Guy was already dead. When Seth finally managed to avert his eyes, the other two had also vanished. Sword Boy and Staff Girl were nowhere to be seen. A shiver went down his spine. Seth realized that the outside would only become more dangerous. He needed to get away from this tree, as far as possible. But what could he do against those vines? It was so dark.
And quiet.
And this time he could actually feel calm reaction, suppressing his panic. He had to think. What could he do? How could he get away? They were silent, so he first needed to see them. He already had an idea concerning that. But he also needed a way to fight them if they came for him. He was a blacksmith. Seth stood up and came before the forge. Looking through the catalog of basic blueprints, he looked for something he might be able to make to help him. The first thing he came across was an axe. Lumberjack's axe.
Common.
Damage: 8 to 30. Durability: 50. A lumberjack's axe, perfect to cut down trees all day long. Grants 2x damage against plants. This could have worked, but the axe needed wood for a shaft, and he didn't have something in a fitting size. But this gave him another idea. He couldn't find it in the catalog, so he decided to try to make the blueprint himself. It was the first time he opened the blueprinting interface for real. It was easier than he had expected. Since he didn't create something completely new but recreated something from his knowledge, the system actually assisted in creating the model and augmented parameters. He chose mediocre iron as the material. What the blueprint showed, in the end, was a hybrid between a machete and a scythe. A billhook. Billhook.
Common.
Damage: 5 to 25. Durability: 30. This sharp tool for cutting down branches and shrubbery can also act as a versatile weapon. Grants 2.5x damage against small and mid-sized plant-based enemies. Grants 1.5x damage against big plant-based enemies. Can cause bleeding. This was the best weapon he could think of to fend off those creepy vines. He had elongated it a bit for more range and slimmed it down a little to lower the weight and save material. Now, he only had to succeed in making it, and he had no idea how often he would have to try. The billhook wasn't as complex as the hunting knife, but it had a lot more material he had to move, and a more difficult shape. Seth grabbed a whole bar of mediocre iron and started the blueprint for the billhook. It took him 2 hours for his first attempt, which ended in a failure when the metal broke during the quenching. His second attempt succeeded, but it was an ugly and heavy result that was barely usable. The third was also a failure. He had burned the metal in the forge. The evening was approaching. The twilight would soon start to darken. Seth was exhausted and decided to take a break and eat something. When he opened the fridge to get some cheese, he found out that the grid had finally broken down. The electricity was gone. Water was still working, though. Making a hard decision, he just ate everything that was still in the fridge. Seth felt a lot better after eating something. The system was really awesome. He looked out into the darkness. In case this attempt succeeded, he would still have some twilight to get away from the tree. If not, he would keep working and travel during the night. It wasn't that much brighter anyway. Seth wouldn't wait any longer once his preparations were finished. The next attempt was actually another failure. The blade had looked very promising, but it developed a lot of cracks when he quenched it. It still actually gave him more than the crappy one he successfully finished, pushing his skill to blacksmith beginner, LV8, 11%.
It was night again outside.
At this point, he was actually worried. What could possibly change tonight? Following a deep breath, he started his fifth attempt. He actually had a good feeling after the last one. Forging the blade, Seth's strikes hit accurate most of the time. The quenching went well. Grinding was hard but succeeded. Once he fitted the handle, he finally heard the announcement.
Ding.
You have created a billhook. Blacksmith, proficiency gained. Seth had finally succeeded. The billhook looked good and felt good in his hands. He knew without using the blacksmith's eyes that it was a good weapon. Still, he appraised it. Billhook.
Common.
Damage, 10 to 20. Durability, 25. This sharp tool for cutting down branches and shrubbery can also act as a versatile weapon. It was made by an aspiring blacksmith and has some defects. Grants 2.3x damage against small and mid-sized plant-based enemies. Grants 1.3x damage against big plant-based enemies. Can cause bleeding. It fell short of the optimal parameters, but it was definitely the best weapon he could get in his situation. Seth was finally armed and ready. Well, no, he was armed, however there were still things he needed to do. First, he smelted the failed scrap metal and then everything that wasn't iron and was spared before, like brass and copper from decorations. This unexpectedly brought his smelting to LV7. Seth went to the forge and entered the free creation. He hammered a few ingots into thin iron plates and punched holes along the rim. Seth wanted to augment the sturdy leather jacket with metal plates and planned to make rivets from the brass and copper, which meant that he had to forge them into rods before cutting them to size. He only made it roughly, so it didn't take too long. Seth affixed plates along the arms like vambraces, 2 rows of 7 on his back, and he put a wider one on the left side of the jacket, above his heart.
Ding.
You have created your first piece of armor. And +1. Reinforced jacket.
Common. Fizz.
Def. 25. Durability. 45 of 50. A leather jacket reinforced with iron plates by an aspiring blacksmith. It's not much, but better than nothing. He was quite satisfied with the outcome, even when it wasn't as cool as he hoped. Together with his sturdy boots, his defense has increased by 1/3. Sturdy leather boots.
Common.
Fizzed at Def. 5. Durability. 18 of 20. A normal pair of good leather boots. Seth put the remaining iron ingots and brass rods into his inventory. He had thought about making a shield, but he didn't have enough wood to make a wooden one, and he didn't have the time or skills to make something that big from iron. Now was the time to finish preparations. The inventory held the things he definitely didn't want to lose. A stack of about 30 mediocre iron bars, a stack of 10 brass rods, leather, a stack of 35 water bottles, 1.5L each. One slot was his grandfather's cane, and he also put his father's binoculars in there, so they wouldn't break if he fell or something. The rest of the slots were filled with the food he had left, like canned soup, packets of noodles, and a pot to cook. Seth went to the room that had belonged to his parents before. From a drawer, he took a small pendant and wore it. It was small and round, made from gold. It felt smooth in his hand, and when he opened it, there was actually a picture of his parents inside. Memories started to surface, but Seth pushed those to the back of his mind and put the pendant under his shirt.
He needed to concentrate now.
He packed his backpack with some of the food he couldn't put in the inventory, clothes, and a pan. Also, the buckles and straps he had scavenged from other clothing. Looking around his apartment, he tried to think whether he had forgotten anything. Maybe a compass would be good? And his smartphone was also leaving with him, as long as it had power. Remembering Mace Guy, he thought of his motorcycle helmet he had lying around from when actually still had a bike, but he already had so little vision at night. Seth didn't think it would help a lot. Before he left, he checked his status just to make sure. Name, Seth Smith. Title, Faster Than the Thought. Level 1. EXP, 80%. Race, Orihuma. Sex male. Age, 23. Class, Spirit Blacksmith, unique. Affiliation, none. Health, 1000 of 1000. Mana, 100 INTX 10. Strength, 13. Dexterity, 17. Agility, 12. Intelligence, 10. Willpower, 10. Endurance, 14. Personality, 7. Luck, 15. Free AP, attribute points, 10. Defense, physical, 122, 42 plus 50 plus 25 plus 5. Magical, 45, 20 plus 25. Fire resistance, 50%. Skill window, calm reaction, passive, LV1. Blacksmith, beginner, LV8, 51%. Blacksmith, S-Eyes, LV1. Smelting, beginner, LV7, 11%. Blueprint, beginner, LV2. Weapon mastery, beginner, LV1. Spirit smithy, LV1. Spirit capture, LV1. Everything seemed fine. He was in top form. This has to do for now, he said to himself as he went to the door. You're about to leave the safe zone. Once you have left the safe zone, it will dissolve and you cannot return. Are you sure you wish to leave the safe zone? Y/N. Seth chose Y and stepped outside into the dark hallway.
Ding.
Welcome, adventurer. You are the 344th to leave the safety zone willingly in this region.
Ding.
Title, Explorer, gained. You are among the first 1,000 of your region to leave the safety zone.
Ding.
Active skill. Map LV1 acquired, thanks to title, Explorer. You have entered Field Boss, the Hanging Tree, a sphere of influence. An ominous fear is entering you from the twilight. Seth felt an irrational fear spreading in him. His heart raced, and he started sweating. As he was about to fall into panic, calm reactions kicked in.
Ding.
Title, bold, gained. Entering the sphere of a field boss as a level 1 is truly bold.
Ding.
Passive skill. Fear resistance acquired, thanks to title, bold. As he was calming down, he looked through the messages and checked his status. He just went outside and gained 2 titles and 2 skills. Map actually opened a map window, but only places he had visited were shown. He looked down the hallway, but could only see ink-black darkness. He pulled his phone from his pocket and used the flashlight to illuminate the hallway.
Ding.
Passive skill. Fear resistance LV1 has become LV2. He regretted lighting up the hallway. The walls were covered in roots that were growing from the walls. He really would have preferred the gore to this. At least the floor has withstood the attempts of nature to penetrate it. He walked down the hallway towards the staircase and came by his neighbor's door. The door was actually left ajar. Seth pushed the door open only to find his neighbor's home being also overgrown with roots. A dried-up corpse was actually sitting in his recliner. It was totally covered in spindly thin roots, like a doll made of twigs. It looked totally macabre and disturbing. "Don, mind me, old friend," Seth told him, shrugged his shoulders and looked for the kitchen. His neighbor wouldn't miss the food anymore. What could be stacked went into the inventory, what couldn't was rationed on the spot. What couldn't be rationed went into the backpack, not that there was much left. Seth left his neighbor's place with a few more days' worth of food, and actually quite a lot of canned stuff. His neighbor seemed better prepared than him. Too bad he had died early. He didn't take any crafting material, there was neither the space nor time for it. Stepping back into the dark hallway, Seth made his way to the staircase. It was completely overgrown. Vines and roots were embracing the handrails and hanging down from the stairs above. However, they didn't seem to belong to the skull penetration kind. They just hung there and did nothing. Still, Seth was walking around with the billhook in hand, in case some naughty vine was just playing dead. When he came to the lobby, Seth finally got his gore. The front door had been broken open, and there were the mangled corpses of some humans and goblins. The humans had actually been armed. Did everyone but him get starter weapons? He picked up a sword from the ground.
Sword.
Basic. Damage, 3 to 7. Durability, 4 out of 8. A simple mass-produced sword. Wow, this was almost worse than his trashy throwing knives. Seth put the sword back. No time, no space. He finally closed in on the gaping hole where the front door once was and stepped outside into the night. Stepping out of the door, he stood at the top of a staircase that led down to the boardwalk. Well, now it was a meadow of high grass. Seth walked down the staircase until he stood on level ground. Summon Spirit Smithy. The skill worked, despite the grass, and the Spirit Smithy appeared before him, flattening the grass it stood on. Seth pulled out a table leg he had gotten from his neighbor's place. It was a lot better for this. That was what he had prepared. Determined, he held it into the eerie white flames of the Spirit Smithy. The soul fire easily turned the wood into a torch. Seth threw the torch into the sea of grass. "Let's see you hide now." He would burn the grass around him, so he could see the vines. But even Seth was surprised at the result. The soul fire jumped into the grass and spread like a wildfire. With an insane speed it shot along the overgrown streets, devouring all the vegetation it came in contact with. And it wasn't just the street. Moments later, he could see the cold white light of his soul fire shining from everywhere in the city, licking about between the rows of houses and illuminating the hanging tree from below. Seth's jaw fell open, watching the calamity unfold. A sea of flames filled his vision, and then a smile crept up his face. He knew that feeling from clips of natural disasters, if you saw something so big and fascinating happen that you could not help but smile and laugh.
Ding.
Title: Arsonist gained. You have set a city aflame and are fascinated by your own deed.
Ding.
Passive skill: Fire Affinity LV1 acquired, thanks to title, Arsonist and skills: Blacksmith, Smelting, Spirit Smithy. Hey.
Wait.
That's not cool. This is a legitimate tactic, okay? I'm not doing this for fun, he argued, but really couldn't suppress the smile on his face.
Ding.
You have killed Hanging Trees Vine LV3. Experience gained.
Ding.
You have killed Hanging Trees Vine LV2. Experience gained.
Ding.
You have leveled up. You are now LV.2.
Ding.
You have killed Hanging Trees Vine LV3. Experience gained. A whole bunch of messages dinged through. Seth was really startled this time. He was afraid the system had suddenly decided to answer him when he argued back. Listening to the notification, Seth noticed that it didn't mention anything other than vines. Had everything that entered the sea of grass died? And level up? When he looked at his status, he was already LV3, and it was fast approaching LV4. The fire really did a great work in collecting him experience.
The
grass around was already burned down, and the vicinity turned dark again. He would better hurry to get away. Who knew what would happen if someone found out that he had burned down the boss's home field? He fell into a moderate running, using his phone to light up the path. The streets were still filled with burning hot air, even after the flames left, but Seth could handle it with his resistance. The newly gained affinity made him actually feel quite cozy in this kind of environment. His ears were ringing when the kill messages had finally slowed down a little. When he checked his status again, he was already LV4, close to LV5, and had gained another 26 free AP. There was actually a new entry SP, skill points. He had 3 now, could he? As he was focused on his status, he saw something moving in the corner of his eyes. He jumped away and fell to the ground before he could even register what exactly it was. Turning back, he saw a half-burned vine. The skull penetration kind. It was lit up by the phone he had lost during a landing. Seth whipped around with a billhook and managed to cleanly cut the vine before it could launch at him again.
Ding.
You have killed Hanging Trees Vine LV4. Experience gained.
Ding.
Skill: Weapon Mastery, Beginner. LV1 has become LV2.
Ding.
Passive skill: Calm Reaction. LV1 has become LV2. He looked at the cut-off part of the vine, and Blacksmith's eyes actually told him that it could be a crafting material, but all he could see was in its description. Was the skill level too low? Anyway, he had to get out of there. So he stuffed the vine in his backpack and kept running towards the outskirts of the city, where the tree's canopy didn't reach.
Ding.
You have leveled up. You are now LV5.
Ding.
Inventory has been extended.
Ding.
New class skill has been unlocked. Check your skill window.
Huh?
There were more? Seth didn't stop to check. He kept going without looking back. At least the headache-inducing kill messages had stopped soon after he reached LV5. He met a few more vines on his way to the rim, but they were no problem. They actually helped leveling his weapon mastery to LV3. But he didn't get cocky this time. The early levels were always easy. At dawn, when the sky slowly became brighter and the sun peeked over the horizon, Seth had finally reached the edge of the tree crown. There was only one problem. From the lowest branches hang a curtain of vines. The fire wasn't able to destroy those vines above LV4, even though they were steaming. Looking for a solution, his eyes fell on the manhole covers. He sighed. Whatever. He summoned the spirit smithy and forged a hook to open the manhole covers with. Surprisingly, there was no stench when he entered the sewer. Oh, he muttered when he saw the reason why. The whole underground was filled with roots. He should have known it. Of course this place would be full of this stuff too. Seth squinted, annoyed. You know, what worked once, he mumbled, resigned.
Ding.
Passive skill fire affinity LV1 has become LV2. Soon the sewers were filled with white flames. The place was instantly filled with dark, stinking smoke, and Seth fled back to the surface. Smoke was also rising from the manhole covers in close vicinity, but it didn't really spread like last time. On the other hand, that didn't mean it was useless. Although the roots didn't burn away, the crown actually seemed to shake in pain, making the vines at the edge sway. It swayed just enough. Seth took this chance, ran up and dove through the gap below the vines, without being noticed. You have left Field Boss, the hanging tree's sphere of influence. He could physically feel the pressure of constant fear that had burdened him since leaving home fall off his shoulders. Hopefully this meant that he wouldn't encounter any more of those vines. Seth didn't look back and started to sprint. Burning trees and broken ruins lined the roads. Gradually, he saw more buildings and ruins overgrown with vegetation. A few minutes later, he finally came to stop at a place the fire had not reached. Here the broken streets were still covered in grass, but it wasn't as high. A lot more buildings had been destroyed by the growing forest. They were higher, and the whole area resembled the pictures Seth had seen of old temples that had been reclaimed by jungle. The undergrowth started affecting his field of view, so Seth slowed down and finally came to stand still. He tried to catch his breath as he scanned his surroundings. Anything could be lurking to jump him in this kind of environment. Of all the things I imagined, this wasn't it when I heard apocalypse. He looked at the map, which showed a several-kilometer-long, more or less straight stretch from his home to here. This place was even marked on the map as jungle biome. Why is there a tropical jungle? In the outskirts, he complained, panting. The humid air made his clothes stick to his skin, and it didn't really help that he wore a thick leather jacket. Seth had actually hoped to get somewhere with less green. You can say whatever you want about a wasteland, but at least it's a lot harder for things to hide. Gi. Seth faintly heard noises not too far away. He had jinxed it. It sounded similar to the goblin he had killed in the tutorial. Seeing a more or less intact building, he slowly sneaked over and entered the dark gaping hole left by the broken-down door. The inside wasn't pretty. Smashed furniture, broken glass from the windows, dirt and roots covered the floor. He walked down a short hallway, and to the right, it was the living room. On the sofa were some mangled corpses. They looked as if wild beasts and gnawed on them. The stench was unbearable, but at least they were no sucked dry mummies. He hoped that this meant that he really wouldn't meet any more vines. Seth could hear the noises outside getting louder, so he anticipated that he wouldn't leave the house anytime soon. Since he was here, anyways, he could look for something usable. Other than the living room, he found a dining room, a small bathroom, and the kitchen on the ground level. The fridge had been ripped open, with the door lying on the ground. Its contents were spread all over the floor, with some squished and other having bite marks. The rest of the kitchen looked similar, with nothing left he could take with him. The squeaking and snarling noises were now really close. When he looked down the hallway, he could see a group of goblins outside on the street. He decided to go up the stairs to avoid being seen. Looking around the upper floor, he found a bigger bathroom and a children's room and the bedroom. Seth rushed back out, about to puke. It was calm reaction that forced the urge back down. Leaning against the wall outside the door, he slid down to the ground. What the F? He mumbled when he remembered the pictures of what he just saw. On the wide bed, in the middle of the room, laid the corpse of a woman. If only it was just that. She had been strapped to the bed with crude ropes. Her whole body, and especially her privates, were horribly mutilated. She was covered in bite wounds, cuts, blood, and more. Something had fun doing its worst to make her death a long and painful procedure. And, to top it off, the body wasn't nearly as old as the two below. Seth had even caught a glimpse at the soul hovering above it. This woman had survived. He even believed to have seen a starter weapon lying on the floor. She had survived the apocalypse to find this kind of tragic end. A noise from downstairs alarmed him. Did it come back? Maybe it were the goblins? Did they do this and came back to check? He swallowed hard and entered the bedroom, closing the door behind him. This was the only door that wasn't broken up here, and he definitely wanted to have a door between him and what was down there. Even if he had to go back in there, he entered and locked the door behind himself. When he turned around, he was a lot calmer. It was even worse than before. She had chunks of meat bitten out of her arms and legs, while she was still alive. The wound had bled. She must have had fought a lot. The ropes at her wrists and ankles had dug deep in her flesh. Seth wasn't an emotional person, but rage was growing in his chest. As if it had felt his feelings, the soul had started floating towards him. It had a tinge of red, and was a little bigger than the pure white ones he had seen on the hanging tree. Vengeful soul, small, crafting material uncommon. A soul filled with rage, and wishes to take revenge on its enemies. Seth didn't do anything. The soul was just gently floating up and down in front of him.
Ding.
A quest has been triggered. Quest: Revenge of the Fallen. Difficulty C. You have encountered the horrifying murder scene of one of your fellow players. Despite the desperate situation, she had not given up. Even after death, her soul still wishes for revenge. Will you help her with her revenge? Requirement: kill goblins 0/10, kill orc 0 out of 1. Rewards: Vengeful Soul, small, 3,000 EXP. Do you accept the quest? He didn't know how much 3,000 EXP actually was, but Seth gladly accepted the quest. It even confirmed that the culprit had been goblins. What a cliché, Seth mumbled. But was it really a cliché when it truly happened? The soul had vanished after he had confirmed his decision. It was probably stored in a special space for pending quest rewards or something. Now what? Seth had a quest. He needed to kill 10 goblins and an orc. He was pretty sure that some of his quest targets were downstairs. Maybe they would come up to look for he grimaced. He would mess those little up. He opened the door and used the billhook's handle to smack the hallway's wall to lure them up. He also took out the cane. It had more reach and was better than an empty hand. The woman's weapon had been a staff, but it was broken, so he couldn't use that. The sounds of steps on the stairs announced the arrival of his opponents. It sounded like 3 or 4. Seth wasn't dumb. He wouldn't fight an open battle. He would ambush them the moment they opened the door. Not long later, the door swung open, and a goblin jumped in, just to be greeted by a massive brass knob smashing its face. The goblin crumbled on the floor and didn't get up anymore. Such an enthusiastic hello had shocked his little companions, which resulted with a billhook piercing one of their heads and popping out an eyeball on the way back out. Seth kicked the goblin on the ground away, jumped back, and slammed the door shut again. One of the pair that was left had reacted a little faster than his friend and jumped forward, which rewarded him a broken nose as the door hit him in the face. With one only reacting now, and the other falling back after being hit by the door opened again, and the billhook saved him the worries about his broken nose. Now Seth stood face to face with the last goblin. Its eyes ripped wide open as it screamed, faltered, and fled. Well, an attempt was made. Seth rushed after it and smashed its skull from behind with a swing of his cane.
Ding.
Skill Weapon Mastery Beginner. LV2 had become LV3.
Ding.
Skill Weapon Mastery Beginner. LV3 had become LV4. Seth went back to the room and finished off the first goblin, who was only unconscious. He knew because had not gotten a kill notification for this one. They had all been LV3 and brought him a few % experience and 3 soul, tiny. They were the first thing he killed, that dropped souls. This strategy had actually worked quite well, but Seth doubted that it would work a second time. If more goblins came, then to look for their lost companions. They would be alarmed and hard to ambush. Once the adrenaline rush had died down and his hands stopped shaking, he went downstairs. Leaving the house via the back door led him to a small yard. Or what was left of it after Mother Nature went berserk. But he found enough space to summon the spirit smithy. Good, he mumbled and went back upstairs to get the goblin bodies. Seth had come up with a good use for these guys. There would be a great surprise waiting for their friends. It took longer than Seth had expected, but after some time there appeared a group of goblins. It were 8 goblins led by a creature about the size of a human. This was probably the orc. It wasn't the weird pig-like kind that some northeastern novels featured, but the green-skinned kind he knew from games. A rough description would be a skin with a moss-green tint, long pointy ears like an elf, a body full of muscles, and a lower jaw featuring a pair of big tusks. When one of the goblins came close to the house, it spotted the corpses of their companion Seth had placed there. The goblins found one of their own on the front lawn. Another was draped over the sofa Seth had placed to block the front door. Big Guy, as Seth named the orc, shouted something at the goblins in a guttural language. 2 of them split off and stayed in front of the house, while the rest climbed over the sofa into the house. Big piles of rubbish, broken furniture, and branches were piled up at the front door and along the hallway. Here they found another body, and the last one on the stairs. Big Guy also entered the house after listening to their hectic squeaking to see for himself. It was time. Seth returned to the yard unnoticed, through the small hole in the thicket he had made with the billhook. Big Guy made his way upstairs, following the trail of blood. He knew that up there was one of his toys the goblins had captured for him. But why had they been up there? It had already died yesterday. Maybe he could find a clue up there. The gobs didn't have the brain to do much more than eat, *CK, and kill. What works twice also works a third time, Seth stated with conviction as he set fire to the heap of rubbish he had piled up at the back door. Like before in the grass, the fire traveled along a trail of frying oil with tremendous speed. Almost instantly it lit up all the trash piles across the house and set it aflame. Burn, he said with a glimmer in his eyes.
Ding.
Passive skill. Fire affinity LV2 had become LV3. Big Guy was halfway up the stairs when suddenly a pale, white flame passed him, traveling up the handrails. Shocked, he looked back down only to see a sea of flames. When had this happened? The goblins behind were already rushing towards the front door only to see that it was blocked by a wall of flames created by the burning sofa and trash piles. Turning around again, Big Guy ran up the stairs as fast as he could, but the flames were already licking towards him from the top of the stairs. He could hear the agonizing cries of the goblins in front. He saw their burning silhouettes rolling on the floor and writhing in pain. And he himself was cornered on the stairs. Flames from above, flames from below, and the fire from the handrails had already jumped onto his rough clothes, burning his skin. Seth could also hear the tragic howls of the screaming goblins within the burning house. But contrary to Big Guy's panic, Seth felt quite satisfied as he also heard the ding of kill notifications. He was waiting on the front lawn. The 2 goblin guards had already been cleaned up by him. He stood in the front yard enjoying the show. Seth had come up with this idea because he felt the urge to give that woman a dignified burial. That whole scene up there should really just vanish from this world. And what would be better than fire? Now, even her murderers were burning to death with her. If this could not satisfy a vengeful ghost, then nothing would. Just as Seth started wondering why he had not gotten a notification about the orc, a loud bang could be heard from the house's wall. With a rain of bricks and debris, a charred orc charged a hole into the house's wall and flopped down on the front lawn.
Haha.
He had survived. Big Guy had collected all the strength he had left and managed to break the wall at the corner he was trapped in.
Air.
Oh, fresh air. His skin was burned black and terrifying pain surged when he moved, but he was alive. He was overwhelmed by the euphoria of having survived. He laughed and took deep breath as he laid there in the grass until a shadow fell on him. It was a tall, lanky human with sickly pale skin. His cold eyes looked down on Big Guy as he brushed back his untamed mane of hair and sighed. Really, why couldn't you be obedient and die up there, Huz? Big Guy's happiness was cut short. Literally. By a billhook.
Ding.
You have killed juvenile orc LV7 experience gained.
Ding.
You have completed the quest, Revenge of the Fallen. You have earned 3,000 EXP and Vengeful Soul, small.
Ding.
Title, Overachiever gained. You completed a quest with over 100% completion. Purse +1 and +1. Yet another title. It didn't seem very hard to gain titles from the system. The 3,000 EXP were about a tenth of his experience bar, and about as much as he got for all the goblins together. Seth looked on as the orc's soul left its body. It was a little bigger than the souls he had seen before. Soul, medium, crafting material. Uncommon. The joy of finding another uncommon souls was dampened by the fact that he couldn't collect it with his skill. Seth had to wait for the house to burn down anyways, so he chose to take a look at his status. He had a hunch about those SPs.
Name, Seth Smith.
Title, Faster Than the Thought. Level, 5. EXP, 28%. Race, Orihuma. Sex male. Age, 23. Class, Spirit Blacksmith unique. Affiliation, none. Health, 1,000 of 1,000. Mana, 110 INTX 10. Strength, 13. Dexterity, 17. Agility, 12. Intelligence, 11. Willpower, 10. Endurance, 14. Personality, 8. Luck, 15. Free AP, Attribute Points, 45. Free SP, Skill Points, 4. Defense, Physical, 122, 42 plus 50 plus 25 plus 5. Magical, 45, 20 plus 25. Fire Resistance, 80%, 50% plus 30%. Skill Window, Calm Reaction, Passive, LV2. Blacksmith, Beginner, LV8, 51%. Blacksmith's Eyes, LV1. Smelting, Beginner, LV7, 11%. Blueprint, Beginner, LV2. Weapon Mastery, Beginner, LV4, 45%. Spirit Smithy, LV1. Spirit Capture, LV1. Map, LV1. Fear Resistance, LV2. Fire Affinity, LV3. Soul Infusion, LV1. When Seth concentrated on SP, he actually got an explanation. There were different kinds of skills, those based on proficiency like Blacksmith, which he could grind, and those he couldn't, like Spirit Forge. They were based on enlightenment or achievements. Those skills could also be raised with SPs. When he chose SP, he got a similar menu to when he chose AP. It showed a list of skills he could add points to. He was already sold on leveling up Spirit Smithy and Soul Capture. He wanted to see how Spirit Smithy would change. While pondering about what other skills he should raise, if any at all, he noticed Soul Infusion. Was this the new class skill? Soul Infusion. Requirements. Spirit Blacksmith LV5. Grants the Spirit Blacksmith the ability to infuse souls into his works during the forging process. This grants the material higher durability/damage/defense and magic conductivity. A primitive form of enchantment. So there were more class skills unlocked when he reached a specific level? Maybe there were other requirements, too? It was definitely an interesting skill, but souls were limited, so he would really have to pick and choose when to infuse them. The skill wasn't too helpful at the moment. In the end, he also chose Blacksmith's Eyes. He still had those cut-off vines that only showed, and really wanted to know. It would also be good if he could identify uncommon materials other than souls, too. He would keep one free SP just in case. Seth was fiddling with his status when he heard a sharp cry like an eagle's in the sky. The sound pierced his eardrums and instantly gave him a headache. Shielding his eyes, Seth looked up into the sky, trying to see through the gaps between trees. It was a shadow. A big shadow. So big that Seth instantly jumped into the ruins of a half-broken house to hide. Whatever it was, he didn't want to meet it. But fate obviously had different plans. The shadow dove towards the ground and stopped above the front lawn of the burning house. With an earth-shattering thump, the figure landed where Seth had stood but a moment ago. Terrifying big claws clasped down on the torso as a sharp black beak tore into the burned body of the headless orc. The best description Seth could come up with was calling it a griffin. The creature had the muscular build of a lion and the head of a raptor. On the other hand, it had 3 snakes for tails and big leathery bat wings, fitting its black leathery skin, glinting in the sun like polished leather. He was pretty sure a griffin wasn't supposed to look like this, but he would call it that for now. The griffin must have been lured here by the smell of burning flesh. It was enthusiastically digging into the half-fried orc, and if Seth was lucky, it would take its time and eat the goblins, too. "Don't notice me. Don't notice me," he chanted in his mind and turned around to peer into the darkness behind him. Leaving the feasting predator behind, Seth slowly and quietly crawled deeper into the ruined house. He twitched every time he made a noise. Any sound felt way too loud in this situation. Seth even controlled his breathing, keeping it as shallow as possible. Hiding in the overgrown undergrowth, only pieces of walls indicated that there had been another half of this house. Everything was moist, covered in vines and moss, as if it had been destroyed for decades. It was a really disturbing sight, if one knew that this happened in just the last 2 or so days. After Seth was sure that he was far enough away, he stood up again to keep walking. Using the map as an indication, he took a relatively straight path into the woods. Somewhere in this direction was Deltan, or City D, was a satellite city in the north, closer to the coast. Deltan had fallen victim to an earthquake some months ago and was supposed to be mostly in ruins right now. This was what Seth counted on. What he needed to level his skills were resources. And after testing the inventory, he was sure that he could harvest the steel from reinforced concrete. So for now, Seth planned to build a base in Deltan and concentrate on growing his skills. He just hoped the woods would end at some point. If he kept going in a straight line, the forest would have to end at some point, right? Time passed slowly.
Ding.
Thanks to continuous training you have gained. Yendi +1. Seth didn't meet a lot of monsters, mostly giant insects he avoided with a passion. But the climate and exhaustion of walking and cutting a path into the dense thicket got to him. Seth had to take a break. He had been going for several hours, and the daylight was starting to dim again. He hadn't slept for almost a day. Even with his grown attributes, this was as far as he could go for now. Should he start investing attribute points? He had really wanted to get as much attribute points as possible by training before using his free ones. It couldn't be helped for now. He clapped his hand and decided to eat something. When in doubt, fill your stomach. Seth summoned the spirit smithy. After dimming the flame a little, he used the fire of the forge to fry a big portion of beans in his pan. He felt like a bandit in a spaghetti western. Filling his stomach with beans restored some of his stamina. A good rest and meal had calmed Seth's mind down. He thought about his situation and had an idea. He wanted to train up the attributes corresponding to his class like STR and DX so he wouldn't waste attribute points. But there was another attribute that could help him right now and was a pain in the butt to train for him. Agility. Agility was the coordinated movement of the body. Movement speed, reaction speed, evasion rate, stamina consumption. His AGI was quite good from the start, but it hadn't grown ever since. Seth had an inkling that the growth of AGI might have a restriction thanks to his class. That's why he decided to dump some of his free AP in AGI and bring it up to 20, making it his highest attribute for now. The effect was immediate. His body's movements became lighter and smoother, and he felt that he had a lot more control and sense of balance than before. He felt less like a smith and more like a gymnast now. Seth felt very energetic and immediately restarted his journey. Thanks to the newly acquired coordination and control, Seth lost a lot less energy traveling in the forest. Despite not feeling completely exhausted, he stopped soon at the foot of a giant tree. The night was approaching. Nighttime in the forest was definitely not something one wanted to experience, and Seth really needed some sleep. He had found the entrance to a cave below the roots of the tree. Upon entering the cave, it became clear that this was not a cave. It had been the basement of a house, before the gigantic tree crushed it under its roots, only leaving this corner of the basement. "This works," he mumbled tiredly, pulling out several blankets. Seth had gotten rid of what little camping equipment he had long before the apocalypse, so he could only bring stuff he had at home. On the other hand, who needs a tent or a sleeping bag if he can have a summon spirit smithy, Seth said, summoning it in front of the entrance. A smithy would always be nice and warm. Rolled snugly into a few blankets, he nestled against the forge. Enjoying the heat of the soul fire, he easily fell asleep. His sleep was comfortable and dreamless. When he woke up, it was so blissfully warm that he felt as if he was wrapped in the fire's caring embrace.
Ding.
Passive skill. Fire affinity LV3 has become LV4. Seth had breakfast and continued his journey. Fortunately, the undergrowth finally became lighter. Shrubs and small trees became sparse and were replaced by the thick trunks of gargantuan trees. The trees had diameters of at least 10 to 20 meters. Parts and pieces of ruins and streets made their appearance again, even though they looked centuries old, with how the trees had broken them apart. It was a quite fantastical scenery, reminding him of recent fantasy movies. The canopy of trees was so dense that almost no light was able to find its way to the ground. It was so dark that Seth could barely see anything, even darker than the twilight below the hanging tree. The ground under his feet was dry and covered in old leaves and sticks that often broke loud and unnervingly similar to bones below his feet. He had stopped wondering how exactly these environments came to be in such a short time. Happy over the much clearer way, his speed increased a lot. He kept his course, thanks to the map. The biome title had changed, and it was called The Dark Woods, very fitting. Seth mused over this as he kept running, until he heard that cry again. With an ear-piercing shriek, he could make out the shadow of another weird griffin jumping between the high branches of the trees. This one was even bigger than the last one, at least the size of a big horse or a bull, and had 2 snake tails. Seth had no choice but to hide by running to the opposite side of the tree. This was the disadvantage of having no undergrowth anymore. It became a lot harder to hide from such flying predators. He just hoped that it had not yet seen him. Maybe the presence of these monsters also explained why he had not encountered any creatures or animals since entering the forest. They were probably the apex predator around here. Seth really didn't want to confront something like that yet. His hopes were in vain. The griffin jumped off the branch it was sitting on and glided down to the ground. Seth heard a big thump in the place he had just stood. There was no burned corpse there this time. It had definitely seen him. It was right on the other side of Seth's tree, and he could actually hear it sniffing on the ground. "I'm so dead," he whispered. The griffin followed his scent, and its heavy steps came closer to the tree. It totally smelled him, which wasn't hard. He had been on the run for more than a day. Even an old lady could smell him from a mile away.
Ding.
Passive skill. Fear resistance LV2 has become LV3. In the same way the griffin was going around the tree, Seth listened to its steps and tried to synchronize with the predator, and kept going around the tree. Maybe he could Scooby-Doo his way out of this one? The tree was humongous, bigger than a sequoia. He could definitely. Seth tripped over something on the ground and fell, face first on the ground. He just wanted to start cursing when he remembered that there was a griffin coming for his buttocks. But his face lit up when he saw what he stumbled upon. A motorbike. It was half buried, stuck under an enormous tree root. If he could get it free, maybe. No. This wasn't the time for this. The griffin was coming. In a panic, Seth squeezed under the root in a hollow space beside the bike. There was a ledge in the darkness, and only emptiness in front of him. The thumping of footsteps grew louder. F***ck it, Seth swore, and squeezed in completely. He fell through darkness and landed on a hard concrete floor. Looking up, he could see the hole he squeezed through some distance above him. The walls felt smooth and cold below his hand. Concrete? He remembered the bike he stumbled over. Maybe a workshop pit. Seth guessed, sliding his hands across the walls to orient himself. Suddenly, it became completely dark in the workshop pit. The little light that fell in from the gap was blocked by the griffin's shadow. Seth tensed up. "Oh, please keep going. Don't mind me and just go," he prayed in his mind, holding his breath in fear. The griffin stood there for a while and sniffed, but passed by in the end. After several minutes of waiting and holding his breath, Seth exhaled. Seth stayed in the hole for another hour, for good measure. That was really a little too dangerous for his taste, so he snacked on some apples while waiting. When he was sure that there was nothing outside his hole, he climbed out, or tried to. He had found some spare parts that confirmed his guess that this was a workshop and needed to stack them to reach the edge and squeeze through the gap. The motorbike was only a little stuck, not grown in, so he could get it out after some wiggling. Ignoring some scratches, the bike was actually undamaged. When he tried to start it, it started humming on his second try. There was even gas left in the tank. The situation in the woods was a really weird condition. The buildings and streets had turned into ruins, as if the woods had been growing for centuries. But on the other hand, all the things such as this bike, provisions, or the occasional car were merely covered in vegetation, but not aged. With this bike, Seth would be out of this terrible forest in no time. He hoped. After looking around some more, he even found a spare canister full of gas. It was a little too clunky, so he freed a spot in his inventory for it. There were also tools and car parts scattered around. This place had probably been a car repair shop or something like that before the apocalypse. On his new vehicle and with a spare can of gas, Seth set off. The woods, which had been quite creepy when traveling by foot, flew by in a blur. Impenetrable shadows? Weird dark mists? Black streams of goopy water? No. Thanks. He broke the darkness with his headlight. Drove past all the creepy places, macabre totems, twig effigies, and bone piles without giving them a second look. Seth wasn't into horror, so he spared himself those experiences. His only regret was that he could now clearly see the ground at all times, which really offered an assortment of half-rotten bones, pale white skeletons, twigs, and leaves. Seth couldn't evade the sight, since the ground looked like this everywhere. Within the next hours, he had crossed more distance than during his whole journey on foot. In the evening, he actually saw the fringe of the woods. They really had an end. Here the big trees ended and sunlight fell in through the gap, where the forest continued with normal trees and shrubbery. And I'm out, ugh, Seth gloated, when something suddenly catapulted him off the bike. The bike kept going, ran up a big route like a ramp, flipped in the air, and finally crashed somewhere beyond the route, where Seth couldn't see it anymore. You can't be serious.
Ding.
Passive skill. Calm reaction LV2 has become LV3. Almost invisible, there was a giant spider web that stretched between two of the last big trees right before the fringe of the forest. Seth's torso and face had crashed into it and were stuck to it now, while his forearms and legs were still free as they dangled in the gabs of the net. Taking a look around, he noticed more webs to the right glinting in the sun, almost like a big fence spanning around the woods. He could only see right, as his face was glued to the net, but he assumed the other side looked the same. Giant spiders. He should have expected this. Seth was really fed up with forests at this point. Why couldn't it be a wasteland? Or a zombie apocalypse? No, he had to end up in a fast-growing forest, or something like that. Seth tried slashing the web with his billhook. Of course, it didn't work. But not only did it not cut the spider thread, even worse, the weapon also got stuck on the web. After half an hour, Seth understood that he could not get the billhook off the web, or himself. But he already had an ingenious idea. He would rely on the tried and trusted. Seth summoned the spirit smithy right below him. This was the first time he noticed the changes after getting it to LV2, because he had been too tired last night. The first change he noticed was that he could choose to summon only specific parts of the smithy, like the forge, or only the grinding wheel. This time, he only summoned the forge with its brightly burning pale blue fire. Seth took the still half-filled gas canister from his inventory. He opened it and splattered gas in every direction below him before dropping it into the spirit forge. What followed was an inferno. The canister fell into the fire, splashing burning gas everywhere and lit up in an enormous jet flame that set the web and surroundings ablaze. Trusting his 90% fire resistance, Seth hoped to free himself from the trap before he got burned to death himself. As he had expected based on game knowledge. Although the spider silk had a great physical resistance, it was very weak to fire. In no time the spider web had burned up and Seth stood on his own 2 feet again. He cancelled Spirit Smithy, picked up his billhook, and hurried out of the forest away from the fire he had set. Seth came down a small slope, where he found the completely demolished bike. He didn't linger for long and crossed a thin band of smaller trees and undergrowth and finally entered a big plain. Wide open prairie, as far as he could see. The map confirmed it. He had entered the grasslands. Seth felt an immense rush of relief surging in him and sat down then and there. With the blazing forest behind him, he finally took a break and checked his status.
Name: Seth Smith.
Title: Faster Than the Thought. Level: 5. EXP: 28%. Race: Orihuma. Sex: male. Age: 23. Class: Spirit Blacksmith Unique. Affiliation: none. Health: 910/1000. Mana: 110. Strength: 13. Dexterity: 17. Agility: 20. Intelligence: 11. Willpower: 11. Endurance: 15. Personality: 8. Luck: 15. Free AP. Attribute points: 37. Free SP. Skill points: 1. Defense. Physical: 122. 42 plus 50 plus 25 plus 5. Magical: 45. 20 plus 25. Fire resistance: 90%. 50% plus 40%. Skill window: Calm Reaction. Passive, LV3. Blacksmith, Beginner, LV8, 51%. Blacksmith's Eyes, LV2. Smelting, Beginner, LV7, 11%. Blueprint, Beginner, LV2. Weapon Mastery, Beginner, LV4, 46%. Spirit Forge, LV2. Spirit Capture, LV2. Map, LV1. Fear Resistance, LV3. Fire Affinity, LV4. Soul Infusion, LV1. Except some burn marks on his clothes and slight burns where he touched the web, he was totally fine. Coming out of that hellfire with almost no injuries? 90% resistance was nothing to laugh at. To his surprise, his willpower had increased a little. After satisfying his basic needs, he got ready to keep going. The bike was gone, but he still had the heightened AGI and a wide flat land to run on in front of him. He checked the map for directions and kept going towards Deltan. A few hours later, the fire had burned out and 2 figures appeared where Seth had left. This wasn't a normal fire, one of them stated. It had the upper body of a human, but her lower body was that of a spider. It was an arachne. Yeah, do you see that? It looks like one of the machines of the Orihuma. It looked fresh. Do you think someone came from in there? The tall figure beside it answered. He looked like a middle-aged man with a dark, scraggly beard, wearing light leather clothing like a hunter. The arachne spoke flustered. From my end there? That's the dark woods we are talking about. And further in is that creepy hanging tree. What could possibly come out of there, other than those corrupted beasts? Yeah, but tell me, who in their right mind would burn down the perimeter fence to get in there? HNG. You are right, I guess. You should go back to the village to report. I will patch up the fence for now. I will have to get some people later to properly close this giant hole. Both looked at the several hectares of burned-down forest. Even the giant trees in that area had burned down to piles of smoldering ashes.
Same time.
Seth had encountered some minor monsters like goblins and something he would call kobold during his journey through the plains. The kobolds were not as cute as in those games and comics, where they resembled cute dogs like corgis. These were more like a really ugly mix of dogs and rats with barely any patchy fur. They would occasionally appear in groups of 3 to 5, as a patrol or sitting around a little campfire. They were only around LV1 or 2, so they didn't pose a danger. He could easily dispatch them with his AGI and the billhook, even in an open battle. After traveling like this for some time, Seth saw something on the horizon. It wasn't really on his route, but it was the only structure that stuck out on these plains, so he made a small detour to have a look. What he saw when he arrived was a small medieval town in the middle of nowhere with a small dirt road winding into the distance. It had a 3-meter-high city wall made of stone and a similar-sized gate. He could see the freshly plowed beginnings of fields in the distance. "Hello there," he greeted the vigilant gate guard. The guard's greeting was to point his spear at him as he asked, Who are you? Where did you come from? I'm just a traveler? Say, what is this place? Calling himself a traveler was the best he came up with. The guard observed him warily. This was the frontier in a destroyed world. What kind of person would a traveler be? But Seth didn't exactly look dangerous. This is Starta Village, one of the Empire's frontier villages in this world, the guard answered in the end. This is Starta Village, a frontier village of the glorious Krona Empire, the guard said motivated. Empire? Seth repeated perplexed. As different as Earth was from Earth, it was a civilized world with advanced technology that had left behind this kind of system a long time ago. Oh, you don't know. The guard gave him a glare that felt as if he looked straight into his souls. No wonder. You are an Ori Huma. Of course you would know. He laughed a lot more friendly than before. You should have seen the oracle of the system, right? This world's boundaries have collapsed, and it is now open to the pathwork. Many people and races use this network of random paths to explore new worlds open to the system. Our empire is one of them. The best, if I may say so, he explained eagerly. The young man could only look confused at the suddenly enthusiastic guard. Remembering the goblins, his gaze sharpened, and he frowned. You say that as if it was a good thing. Don't those monsters like goblins also belong to the races that came over? He said bitterly.
Ah.
Yes, the guard stuttered and scratched his neck. I think our priest would be better in explaining the situation than me.
Please come in.
You just have to follow the main street, straight to the church. With that, the guard stepped out of the way. He still seemed a little embarrassed and tried to stand straight with a serious face, which made it look quite awkward. Seth ignored the guard's misery and entered the town. Within the boundary of the city wall, the streets were covered in cobblestone. The houses looked more or less medieval and were neatly built along the wide streets. The town looked open and well planned out. Seth did as he was told and followed the main street. He came across all kinds of shops. There were colorful signs written with foreign symbols on the shops. Seth couldn't read them, but they somehow translated themselves in his head. He saw a bakery, a pharmacy, a general store, and even a blacksmith. This was definitely worth checking out later. This place made him feel more like a transmigrator than a survivor of the apocalypse. The church was standing at the end of the main street. It wasn't big or pompous like some churches he knew from history lessons. It was a big but simple building and gave more of an office building kind of vibe. A simple sign hung above its door which actually just said church. He entered and immediately felt reminded of an administration, not a place of worship. There were several counters with clerks, definitely not clergy. Seth felt a glare, similar to the guards, and was approached the next moment. Hello there, my young friend, Santa Claus said. Wait, no, not Santa Claus. It was a tall and wide man in his later years. He had no hair on his head, but the bushy rim of gray hair on the sides made it look like a shiny egg in a nest. What he didn't have on his head, he had in his face. His beard was well-groomed, voluminous, and easily reached his big belly. He wore a wine-red robe with white and golden accents. It made him totally look like Santa Claus. Hello, are you the priest? Seth lifted his eyebrow and looked at him questioning. Yes, that is correct. I am Simon Carell, the priest of this little Starta village. Did the guard send you here? How did you? I can see that you are an Ori Huma. Seth looked at himself. He was dirty and sweaty all over. His clothes were ripped and dirty in many places. Is it my clothing? How did you know? What does Ori Huma even mean? Come to my office. Let us not talk here, the priest invited. Seth just shrugged his shoulders and followed him. They entered a big office. The walls were covered in bookshelves filled with all kinds of interesting stuff and big old books bound in leather. There was also a big fireplace, but it wasn't burning at the moment. Simon sat down behind a big desk made of dark shiny wood. He groaned as his old bones could finally relax. Okay, Seth, let's start with how I know your race and name. He smiled mischievous when Seth's eyes opened wide upon the mentioning of his name. It's a skill called observation. Anyone can learn it. It was literally an appraisal skill for creatures. The higher the skill S level and the user S level, the more information from the target S status could be seen. After the priest explained to him how the skill is learned, Seth tried to concentrate mana in his eyes and looked at Simon.
Ding.
Skill. Observation LV1 has been learned. Name. Simon Carell. Level. Race. Huma. Sex male. Age. 67. Affiliation. Church of the System. This was all he could see, the rest of the information was either not there or glitched. Seth also had the inkling that Simon let him see some of it on purpose. Now that this question is answered, there is something I will have to do. Simon stood up from his chair and came to halt in front of Seth. He bowed to him. I am very sorry. He apologized to the young man in front of him. Seth was baffled. What are you apologizing for, old man? Even though we see it as a blessing to a dying world, when pathwork is open to them and the survivors become part of the system, it is also true that the situation immediately improve. We know that with the pathwork, a lot of foreign monsters will also enter this already battered world. On behalf of our God, I ask for your understanding. Simon looked at the young man sitting in front of him. His face didn't betray any of his thoughts until the dam broke and a flood of words flowed from Seth. Say, you always speak about races and monsters. What about those weird trees? Can you please explain this crazily growing menace? The whole city was completely overgrown in a few hours. And then that hanging tree thing? What kind of dipshit crazy world brought out a tree that decorates itself with the sucked dry corpses of its victims? Simon smirked a little. Yours. What? Yours is the dipshit crazy world that came up with that kind of thing, Simon said with roaring laughter. Your hanging tree was one of the dangers the system had warned us about before we entered your world. And you actually came out of that place. You are really lucky. Maybe even special, he continued after having a good laugh at Seth's perplexed face. It took Simon a while to catch his breath. Simon went to one of the bookshelves to the side and came back to the desk with a thick folder. The thickest there was on the shelf. Similar to the vision you had when you entered the system, we have oracles given to us before we enter a new world. Yours is very special. Normally these folders only have a few pages. Look at this thing. Simon smacked it on the table with a loud thud to show how humongous the collected oracles of Earth were. It was easily thicker than any book Seth had ever seen in his life. You could probably bludgeon someone to death with that. The priest sat down and started to browse the giant folder in a way so Seth could not see the contents. At some point, he took out a few pages and slid them across the table to Seth. There, see. It's a native apocalypse scenario. But we don't really understand the full text. Some words have no meaning to us. Seth looked down on the pages. There was a hand-drawn pictures of the giant hanging tree that towered over dark ruins and oceans of trees. The first pages described in depth the phenomenon of the fast-growing forest, which read almost like the setting of a horror movie. It started with an attempt to stop the climate change. Using advanced technology like genetic engineering, they tried to create variant species of trees for any climate that would grow a lot faster than usual, given the needed nutrients. During the breaking point event. What is the breaking point event? Seth asked, confused. Oh, it's what we call the point in time when the events that lead to the apocalypse reach the point when they start to exponentially increase and spiral out of control. Simon thought for a moment. Take your climate change, for example. You see it slowly change. You register weather phenomena and temperature variation. They get stronger and worse, but there is that one point in time when everything escalates to a stage people won't be able to cope with anymore. That's the breaking point event. During the breaking point event, the laboratories and test sites working on this solution were hit by natural disasters. What came out of the destroyed laboratories and test sites were mutations of prototypes that could grow with a speed visible to the naked eye. The papers also mentioned that other scenarios had intersected with this and worsened it even more. It also mentioned several spells and magic formations that could stop the forest from expanding, which was probably why Seth had reached these plains at some point and was not trapped on a continent drowning in trees. The next pages were about a special mutation, the hanging tree. It described its characteristics like the position in the center of a vast biome of fast-growing forests, that it matures within a matter of days, the eternal twilight below its crown, and that the area will be filled with solanum once the previous vegetation died off from the lack of sunshine. Of course, it also described the vines Seth had come across and how exactly it hunted and digested its victim that dared to enter below its canopy. The reports were too detailed to be just made up. After reading these few pages, Seth understood that these trees were quite supernatural, but they did not come from another world. His eyes fell on the thick folder. These were just a few pages of this tome that described the changes of his world. "Can I have a look at this?" Seth reached out for the folder, but it suddenly vanished from the table, as did the pages in his hands. The priest gave him an apologetic smile. Hum, once again, "I am sorry, but this one, happen." Simon looked to the bookshelf, where the folder had reappeared. Seth looked at him questioning, but didn't say anything. "The rules don't allow something that comes this close to a direct intervention with the natives," he explained. "You see, our god travels across dimensions to look for entertainment. He seldomly intervenes with healthy worlds or primitive worlds without sentient lives, as they are boring. But when he comes across a world in trouble like yours, he reaches out a helping hand. Orihuma have a higher stat growth and learning speed than us, who come via the pathwork. But everything comes with a price." Simon looked at the young man to see if he could follow his narration. "And that price is," Seth played along, "struggle. He gives you the system to help you survive, but whether you survive or not is up to you and your choices." Seth remembered the last thing the system had said: "Whether you die in this foreign world or become the master of your own fate is all up to you. But don't worry. Our God isn't cruel. Right now you have two choices. If you don't want to struggle outside, you can join our empire and stay in this town. If you do not wish to be bound to the empire, you can only stay temporary. You can trade in this town and buy provision, but you can't live here permanently," Simon explained seriously. Seth thought about it. Not joining didn't seem to have any big disadvantages. He didn't wish to stay here anyways. It was probably a good choice for survivors who preferred a peaceful life. Seth didn't have a good feeling at the thought of joining people. He would probably have to interact with people and take orders. No, he had a different plan. He wanted to find a place to grind his class before he decided to join a faction or not. "Say, how did you build such a big town in just 2 days?" He changed the subject. Simon understood his intentions and went along. It was not actually built here. Portal scouts marked this location as a good place for a frontier village, since there are no high-level creatures or dangerous anomalies anywhere close, and the land seems fertile. The whole town is actually something that is prepared in the Empire and then teleported to fitting coordinates in other worlds. "You may come across similar methods when you meet other races," Simon said with a benevolent smile. He really looked like Santa Claus. Seth and Simon talked for a while longer about the town and the Empire until Seth stated his interest in exploring the town and excused himself. Seth left the church with a better understanding of the New World setting. Earth was quite chaotic, with all kinds of end-of-the-world scenarios rampaging. And on top of that, extra-dimensional powers were setting up camp to claim land and resources in this ownerless world. On the other hand, the surviving natives, the original human or Orihuma, had growth benefits granted by the system, so those powers tried to reel them in early. Like hell, he would join some faction. Without any power, he would probably turn into someone's dog. Seth felt lucky that Simon seemed to be unable to see his class. Passing the stores, he took a quick glance and decided to stock up on provisions for the journey. The satellite city Deltan wasn't that far away anymore, but he would stay there for a while if he found a place that fit his criteria. Seth entered the general store where he found a wiry old man at the counter. It was one big room split by big shelves filled with various miscellaneous wares. "What can I do for you, lad?" The old man interrupted his thoughts. "Hello, I was looking for rations and stuff for traveling. Do you have something like that?" The old man squinted at him, and he felt the glare again. He had used observation on him. "Heh. And what are you going to pay with? You are an Orihuma. Do you have anything of value you could trade for it?" Seth had already thought of something and put some of his metal ingots on the counter. After the old man appraised them, he vanished into the room in the back. Seth heard him rummaging around in there before he came back with a big bag of jerky and loaves of bread. "That's what I can give you for those iron ingots. Take it or leave it," the old man said as matter of fact. Seth shrugged his shoulders and accepted the deal. He packed up the stuff and left. The ingots actually seemed to be worth more than he thought. And there would be more of them once he reached his destination. The stuff he got should be enough food for maybe 2 weeks. He came across the blacksmith store again and hesitated, looking around the street slowly filling with people. It was getting late and people were done with work. Seth was becoming jumpy. It had been a long time since he was among people, and he had developed an aversion to groups of people. Despite this, he decided to give the shop a look. He entered a large showroom. There were a great variation of weapons mounted to the walls, and some armor sat on their stands gathering dust. Using his blacksmith's eyes, he could check everything on display, but he found nothing special among the items here. The best weapons he found were only slightly better than his billhook. Was this really a blacksmith's shop? How could it be that a bloody beginner like him made stuff comparable to a professional? "Oh, I see you have eyes of a craftsman," a voice hollered from behind the counter. "A dwarf."
Not.
It was just a small old man, not an actual dwarf. Seth made sure. It was a very embarrassing moment for both of them when the first thing he blurted was to ask whether the shop owner was a dwarf. The old man cleared his throat to break the awkward silence. "I am not a dwarf. If I was, my skills wouldn't be so mediocre at my age, and I wouldn't be stuck in a frontier village," the old man lamented, self-deprecating. "Anyways, I am Claude. What can I do for you?" Seth looked around and was suspicious of his class's performance. "Maybe you could help me ascertain something? As you said, I also am kind of a craftsman. Actually, I am an aspiring blacksmith, but I wasn't able to compare notes with other blacksmiths yet. Would you take a look at my weapon and maybe give me some tips?" Seth said and put his billhook on the counter in front of the old man. Claude picked up the weapon and gave it a good look. He weighed it in his hand and did some practice swings before checking the blade closer again. It's a really good weapon. To be able to do something like his at your age shows that you must have great talent. If I had to criticize something, I would have to say that your hammer technique still needs some work. I never seen such a weapon, but from its shape and weight I can judge that it's a front-heavy weapon. The balance is a little off. Without so much as a pause, the blacksmith kept rattling on. Did he even breath?
Ding.
You gained proficiency by listening to another blacksmith's. From the chips in the blade here, I would guess that the heat treatment probably has some problems, but with this kind of blade shape it wouldn't be easy to begin with. All in all, it's a good weapon for an adept blacksmith. He finally ended his verdict.
Ding.
You gained proficiency by listening to another blacksmith. Adept blacksmith? But he was only at the beginner level. It's a good weapon for an adept blacksmith? Seth asked again. Oh yes. Don't worry, I didn't look at your status. I can judge from your work that you are probably adept LV2, maybe LV3. He sighed. You are so young and already almost as good as me. Maybe in a year or 2 you could even start working with uncommon materials. With this, Seth's suspicions were verified. His skill growth was separated and different from that of a normal blacksmith. Was it a passive increase from his class, or was it the strengthening from the system? What he created was actually evaluated as the work of an adept, a level higher than his skill was. It reaffirmed his decision to grind his class as fast as possible. This coincided with his desire to leave the town. The streets started to become packed. Where did all these people come from? In a hurry, the young man said goodbye to the old smith and left the town. The sun was already setting. Seth wanted to curse. To have squandered so much time here. Now the sun was setting, and the young man had to decide. Would he stay in the city, or just walk through the night? Checking his map, he guessed that the satellite city wasn't too far away at this point. Seth had been traveling in a straight line ever since he left the hanging tree behind. The town was actually a good indication. The priest had told him that the coordinates for the frontier villages were chosen based on the available resources. They were after the same stuff, Seth hoped to find in the city. When he thought about all the trouble that came with staying in the town, like finding the inn, paying without money, in the end he decided to use the night and make some distance. With a last flickering, the sun vanished behind the flat horizon and left the world in twilight. A chill came as the sunlight left, but it wasn't cold. The ground was smooth and the grass soft below his feet, so he could comfortably run along.
Ding.
Thanks to continuous training you have gained Yendi +1, the system announced its existence. Another welcome bonus of traveling on. The twilight soon faded and left Seth with a breathtaking view. Surrounding him on this flat plain was a brilliant starry canopy, shining brightly in the night sky, illuminating his way. It was his first time seeing this kind of view. Earth's skies had long been darkened by light pollution and smog, and the last few days were spent in dense woods. Running along the plains surrounded by stars, he understood when people described something as swimming among the stars. On the opposite side to where the sun had sunken, rose the moon like a polished silver coin. It even outshone the stars like a white sun. Was the moon always this bright? All this together with the breeze in the night felt very magical, washing away his fatigue. Using the light of the stars and moon, he could see almost as clear day, and thanks to his map, he easily found his way. Still, sometime close to midnight the fatigue caught up, and he had to take a break. He wanted to check his smartphone for the time, but it wouldn't turn on. Maybe it was damaged during the explosion? With a shrug, he put it back in his backpack. Even if it was broken, he did not feel like letting go of it. Summon Spirit Smithy. The best remedy for fatigue was still food. That was what he had learned in this short time at the system. So, he heated up one of his remaining canned soups and ate it with a piece of bread from the bag he bought. Afterwards, he dismissed the Spirit Smithy and sat down in the grass. Seth enjoyed the feeling of his filled belly and the view of the starry skies, when all around faint glimmers started to light up in the air like fireflies. Fireflies? Remembering his new skill, he concentrated mana into his eyes. Name, none. Level, 4. Race, fairy. Affiliation, fair folk. Seth's eyes widened astonished. With the skill he could actually see the details of the small fairies. They were actually shiny little humanoids all around LV4. With about 5 centimeters height, they were smaller than Seth would have imagined, but the wings of butterflies or dragonflies on their backs were just like in fantasy. The fairies were dancing and laughing across the night sky, and even enhanced this incredible sight. As terrifying as the world had become overall, one had to admit that it also became very magical and interesting. When they noticed the young human sitting on the ground and watching them with a dreamy smile, the fairies became curious. They came closer and started dancing around him. The little pranksters touched him and flew away laughing as if playing a game of dare. They noticed that Seth only laughed and played along, but didn't act hostile, so their confidence grew, and the fairies even landed on him and started nosily touching his damaged clothing. It still had durability and defense, so Seth had not bothered changing to something nicer. While Seth worried about his ragged appearance, the fairies wonder about the fine fabrics his rags were made of. On the other hand, the little guys also made some offensive gestures pointing out his smell. Finally, they could not hold back anymore. "Hey, human, what are you doing out here in the middle of the night?" said one.
Yeah.
"Don, do you know it's dangerous out at night?" Seth looked at them startled. He had not come across any dangers yet. "What dangers are you talking about? All I saw were goblins and such. You guys are just LV for yourselves. We can fly. We have super strong magic. Our name is Legion, for we are many," wasn't what the fairy said, but Seth joked about it to himself. Others interjected to count up the dangers that could lurk in the dark. "There are vampire bats at night," one said. "Have you never heard of evil ghosts? We defeated one just yesterday," another said with a smug smile and pushed out its meager chest. Evil ghosts? As if things were not bad enough already, Seth thought, but he said, "Evil ghosts? I have never seen one in the last few days."
Ha.
"Of course you didn't," the little one said. "Of course you didn't. Of course you didn't," the others chortled. "It's because we get rid of them," they proudly stated. So, contrary to what you said, there is no actual danger since you got rid of it. Yes. Air, it mumbled perplexed and rubbed its head embarrassed. Seth grinned at the suddenly speechless little creature. He talked a while longer with the fairies until he felt recovered enough to continue on his journey. Oh yeah, he turned around now that I think of it. Do you guys maybe know about the city north of here? Is there anything I have to know? He asked them.
North. North.
North. They went in a chaotic choir. Yes, I know. Aren't there abandoned ruins in that direction? One of them roughly gestured north. Some of them shuddered, and others rushed over to make it shut up. Dawn, talk of that place. Don't talk. Many of them looked very frightened upon the mentioning of the ruins. Dawn, go there, human. One of them came forth. In those ruins opened a portal to a dark place. Corpses raise up and walk around, and plants withered away and turned to dust. It's a wasteland of dash. Perfect, Seth interrupted. What? They went. After his experience with the forest, a place without any plants at all sounded like paradise. Undead sounded a hell of a lot better than skull-penetrating vines. Not to mention those fucked-up griffins. Thank you guys for the information. Maybe we will meet again. Before they could stop him, Seth waved at them a last time before he fell into a comfortable running pace, heading towards the satellite city. Wasteland of Death. Here I come. Wasteland of Death, here I come? Go *CK yourself past me. Seth was crouching behind a mound of rubble, hiding from a horde of zombies. What happened? It was all great when he had just arrived early in the morning. The sun was just peeking over the horizon, shining onto the streets of Deltan, which had become a complete wasteland. With the sun came an unexpected heat. The plains had slowly turned into a shallow, dried-up field of sand. The closer he came to the city, there was no presence of humans or any live to speak of. The city looked as you would expect it to look after being hit by an earthquake. Seth consumed news only sparsely, so he couldn't remember when exactly Deltan was destroyed. Seth was sure that the city had not been abandoned, at least not before the apocalypse. He could even make out signs of reconstruction. But now he couldn't see a living soul. It looked like a ghost town. Many buildings had crumbled and dry wind blew sand and dust through the ruins of the city. The streets were covered in broken cars, rubble, and debris. Then he heard something. In the shadows away from the sun, in the rubble of a broken building, he could see a silhouette. Zombie. Name, none. Level 2. Race. Undead. Affiliation. None. There he was. His first undead encounter. It was quite gruesome. The corpse looked like the typical ones you would expect from a movie, just very uncensored. One of its eyes had been gouged out, and its scalp was ripped off the skull. It was dragging its intestines along the ground behind it. What most movies missed were the heaving and squirming of the zombie's skin. It oozed fluids and pulsated from the overwhelming amount of maggots. At least it wasn't leaving the shadow, he thought, until it dove at him from the shadow. The moment sun fell on its rotting skin, white smoke started rising from the undead. It wasn't a problem. Seth had readied his billhook the moment he saw it and kept observing it the whole time. With a swipe of his weapon, he split its skull along the empty eye socket.
Ding.
You have killed zombie LV2. You have earned experience. The experience was okay. Maybe he could level up after killing 1 or 200. They were not strong. The bigger problem was how disgusting the spray of zombie juices all around were. He instinctively dodged the splatter, but it still stuck to the billhook's blade.
Ding.
Passive skill. Calm reaction. LV3 has become LV.4. It wasn't him killing a zombie, but him dodging the juices that made it level up. Sometimes the system was just weird. Seth had used the morning to explore the desolate city and look for a place to stay. The fatigue was really catching up now. While searching a good base camp, he could finally test the whole reason he had come here to begin with. All over the place were broken ruins made of reinforced concrete. The rebars were poking out from the ruins and rubble like the bones of an open fracture. Mediocre steel. Crafting material. Common. This was what he was after. Grabbing a reinforcement bar, he confirmed his theory. With a thought, it vanished and appeared in his inventory. Rebar steel was abundant in a modern city. With this, he could harvest an unimaginable amount of iron and steel by mining the city. This was enough steel to easily grind his skills to a high level. If it had not worked, he would have had to make a pickaxe to harvest the steel. But now he could just pick off all the exposed rebar first. Dodging and killing zombies on his way, he searched for a good place to settle down, all while picking up more rebar. Finally, around noon, he chose an intact apartment building he had found. The windows on the first 2 floors had bars, and the entrance doors were thick and sturdy wood. However, it didn't help the previous residents. These hallways were blood-splattered and horrible, like in a horror movie. Doors were broken left and right, some from outside and some from the inside. Seth also came across some intact doors. Were these the safe rooms in the city? Then where were the people? Eventually, he was tired. Seth went ahead and checked the building for zombies. After finding none, he barricaded the front doors and chose a place that looked still okay. There were others that looked very run down. Most of the places looked run down and dirty, a lot worse than they should for just a few days. Seth was probably right. The city had not been completely abandoned after the earthquake, but it didn't look like the people who stayed had a good time here. Seth put down his backpack and laid down on a bed you could describe as clean, mostly. Despite his worries, he could only give in to the fatigue. He instantly fell asleep. That's where the problem started. Seth actually slept through the whole day and deep into the night, until he was woken up by the wails of the fucking damned. Shrill cries and deep moans broke the silence of the night and made him jump off the floor. Looking outside, he saw a parade of undead filling the streets. The worst sight were the hordes of zombies in all kinds of state of decay.
But there were not just zombies.
Above them floated ghosts and specters glowing in a pale blue light, and skeletons with eerie bluish-green pale flames in their eyes were mixed among them like shepherd dogs. It became more fantastical when he spotted armored undead in dark rusty plate armor and floating skeletonized torsos without hips or leg, wearing dilapidated robes. Seth did not dare to use observe on any of them, so he could only guess that those were skeleton wizards and death knights. Fuck me, Seth lamented about the fantasy elements. Then a terrifying thought struck him. Could they see the aura of living beings? Couldn't undead normally see stuff like that? Would they see him up here if they looked in his direction? The young man had jinxed it. Just in this moment, a skeleton soldier turned the head around, and its pale flaming eyes met with Seth's.
Ah, shit.
Seth fell back from the window and snatched his backpack in a hurry. He charged out of the apartment and up the stairs. The streets below were filled with undead. There was no way he would go down there. There was still a small chance the skeleton had not seen him, right? The roof was his best chance. Worst case scenario, and they send something after him. Maybe he could jump to the neighboring rooftops to keep running. Heavily panting, he finally reached the rooftop. Or what was left of it. Part of the roof had collapsed, and he had to switch from stairs to debris while climbing up. Close to the rooftop, Seth sat down and kept observing the junction where the stairs transitioned into debris. He took care not to be easily spotted from that junction and have a way up to the rooftop for his escape. The building had about 5 stories. Even with the barricaded front door, it would not take too long for a group of undead to catch up. In the meantime, he tried to hide himself as much as possible. The waiting started to gnaw at him. He nervously tried to think of a way to improve his situation. If only he had a skill to suddenly, he thought of the way the priest had told him to obtain observe. Seth started trying to manipulate his magic power. When he tried to pull in the flow of magic power.
Ding.
Skill. Concealment LV1 has been learned. Seth's eyes lit up. This was perfect timing. It had actually worked. Looking at the skill in the skill window, Seth found out that it could faintly conceal his presence. It would use up mana over time, and he could toggle it on and off. Of course, he activated it immediately. Not a moment too late. The undead had actually noticed him and had sent a group of zombies. And that is how we got here. The stairs were filled with stumbling and staggering corpses in all kinds of terrifying states, discharging all kinds of growls and moans that climbed the stairs. These zombies were a little different from the ones he saw during the day. They had the same flames as the skeleton burning in their eyes. Seth didn't know whether the concealment had worked. What he had not seen was that the zombies had actually rushed up the stairs a lot faster and came to a confused hold close to the rooftop. However they knew that he was up there, it was disabled by the skill. As the zombies started spreading to the debris, Seth decided that he had to leave now. He climbed up to the roof. It was a flat roof and had some holes like the one behind him, where it had caved in. It might be possible to hide up here until the zombies left, but Seth wasn't sure about that. Looking over the edge, he could the wriggling bodies of the undead hordes in the light of the shining stars. Jumping onto another roof might be seen, so Seth actually dove into one of the other holes where the roof had caved in. It was a big slab of the roof that reached into a room 2 stories below. Following it, he arrived in the ruins of a small apartment. Suddenly, the relative silence of the night was broken by loud roars and grunts from the rooftop. The zombies were going crazy after they suddenly discovered their prey again. Seth's mana had run out. Start a village. In the night after Seth left Start a Village, the figure of a hunter appeared at the closed city gates. "Hey, Tom. Let me in." He called for the guard to open the door. "Simon, I am in a hurry." "God damn, Wilton. Why are you here so late? Did something happen at the fence?" The guard complained as he opened the gate for the hunter to slip in. "Yeah, I got a report to the priest." He patted the guard's should and passed by him. Wilton left the guard behind and tiredly walked towards the church building. After the several hours of walk, he still wasn't sure how to describe what had happened. He was still trying to come up with how to phrase it as he opened the door to the priest's bureau without knocking. Simon was sitting on his desk munching on cookies and reading in the thick folder he had shown to Seth. Some things that had happened in this world read like a terrifying but fascinating horror novel. He looked up when he heard the door open.
Oh.
"Wilton." He closed the folder and put the bowl with cookies away. "What happened? For you to come here at such a late hour is unusual. You look tired." "Priest Simon, I don't know how to say it, but something happened at the perimeter fence." Hum. At the fence? What happened?" Simon was sure that Seth had probably come from there. Did the young man have something to do with it? Those arachne webs were quite strong. They were meant to keep the corrupted beasts inside the wood. Did he damage them when he tried to get out? For him to be able to damage them, he was already so strong at this early stage. "It was burned down," Wilton said, scratching his head embarrassed. "What?" Simon's eyes widened in disbelief. "A part of the forest and the fence were burned down. Completely burned to ashes. When we arrived, only dust was left," the hunter elaborated. "Wow. That." Seth's face came to Simon's mind. It couldn't be him, right? Even if he was an Ori Huma, it couldn't possibly be him. To burn those webs was one thing, but to turn those gigantic corrupted trees into ashes. What kind of fire would it need? Current time Deltan. Seth was in a predicament. He lacked the mana to keep concealment going, and the zombies suddenly went crazy. At least it proved that the skill worked.
No. This was not the time for that.
Seth stood in a devastated room at the end of a big debris slab made of roof, and a zombie horde was rushing to his location. He could barely make out a door behind the slab and rubble. He crouched down and crawled on the ground towards the door. Behind the door in the rubble, he found a very small intact bathroom. It felt a little weird to make his last stand with his back towards a toilet, but he couldn't choose at this point. Here, even if the zombies knew where he was, Seth could fight them off as long as they were forced to come one by one. Since they had to crawl into this tight space, he could easily pick them off. The sound of rushed shuffling and dragged feet came from the rooftop, together with agitated grunts and growls, and the zombies started descending the slab. Seth stood in the door frame and readied his billhook to chop at any corpse that dared to crawl in here. When the zombies came in sight, he used what little mana had recovered to use Observe on them.
Zombie.
Name, none. Level, 5. Race, Augmented Undead. Alignment, Argot Knower. Augmented? Did their eyes shine because of that? He had not much time to think. With a whoosh, the billhook latched into the first zombie's head and split it open.
Ding.
You have killed zombie LV5. You have earned experience. They definitely gave above average experience. Seth had gotten a good amount of sleep, so he kept chopping at the zombies like a machine. At this point, he was glad that he had no time to eat anything. What he saw and smelled would have been even worse with a filled stomach. Luckily, the zombies weren't the brightest and kept rushing at the small gap, clogging it up and hindering each other. They kept pulling their dead back out. At first, Seth thought they had realized that those clogged up the gap even more. But they were not that bright. Maybe those trying to force their way and pulled out the lifeless ones on accident? But soon Seth got a glimpse outside. They actually started devouring their dead. Soon Seth couldn't care too much about it and kept swinging his weapon. Sometimes he heard notifications, but he could not spare any attention at this time. The zombies came in without end. The young man could see no end to this sea of enemies. At some point, hours later, he stood ankle-deep in rotten blood and didn't feel that he could keep going. His body kept slaying zombies nevertheless. Seth started losing hope, although there were less and less augmented zombies. When he checked, most of the zombies who sieged him by now were ordinary ones. Whether they were sent or lured by the stench of blood, he didn't know. Seth couldn't go on like this. His arm was numb and his body ached. While he desperately tried to come up with a plan, his body subconsciously kept chopping. He could only thank his growing skills. Even as tired as he was, the precision of his swing became a lot better and effective. However, his only fortune was that no intelligent undead had turned up to stop this meat grinder. In the end, there was only one idea he had. It was the masterstroke of his tactics. It was a crazy idea that had taken over his tired mind. A weak smile sneaked on his face as he checked his mana. It had recovered quite a bit in the last hours. "You force my hand." "Really? Don't blame me for this," he said with a maniacal laugh. Seth summoned the spirit furnace in the gap before him. He ramped up the power until the flames spewed from its top and kicked the furnace over. The blazing flames shot into the small gap filled with blood, body parts, and debris, and devoured anything in their way. The fire easily spread among corpses and zombies filling the gap and those waiting outside. They burned like tinder under the pale blue fire. It was the first time something different from grunts reached Seth's ears. Guttural screeches and scream filled the night as the undead acted as if in pain, whining and tumbling around, hitting others in their desperate throes to put out the fire. The flames jumped from undead to undead and onto the surroundings. In a matter of moments, the fire spread all over the building.
Ding.
You have killed zombie LV3. You have earned experience.
Ding.
You have killed zombie LV2. You have earned experience.
Ding.
You have killed zombie LV3. You have earned experience. Like before in City B, a whole slew of kill messages dinged away in his head, almost giving him a headache. It kept going for a while before it slowed down. The fire probably killed most zombies in the vicinity. When Seth dismissed the spirit furnace, the fire had already spread all over the place and started devouring the building's structure. He relied on his resistance to withstand the heat and noticed that neither the heat nor the flames surrounding him did any damage. Seth could freely move within the sea of flames. He used this to concentrate on dodging falling debris and find his ways to safe spots within the fire. Soon Seth reached a balcony on the second story and could see the streets below. Except for some burning corpses, they were completely empty. The undead parade was gone. Had the undead evacuated to dodge the fire? It didn't matter now. At this point, he activated concealment, climbed down to ground level, and sneaked into the building on the other side of the street. There were some lone zombies here, but Seth managed to sneak past them and up the stairs. And no matter how much his tired legs screamed, he kept going up the stairs until he was almost at the roof. Only then did he pick a door and entered a new apartment. It actually looked a lot better in here. When he found the quite clean bed in the bedroom, his heart jumped. There was no way Seth could resist. He barricaded all doors up to the bedroom before throwing his backpack to the side and lying down. This had been a really terrifying night. He hoped that the sun would soon rise and ban those undead back into the shadows. And then, during the day, he would go around and burn down their hideouts when they canned run. It was a happy thought before he fell asleep. Omega City, northwestern part of Earth. Today is the day we bring the glory of our king to another world. The new world opened to us by the Pathworks is called Earth. It was a pathetic world, without an ounce of magic. It is us who will bring these poor heathens back into the embrace of God King Persa. For Argot Noer, the impulsive high priest of God King Persa, was walking up and down in front of the troops that were about to enter this new world. Earth was a world with one gigantic continent surrounded by a mighty ocean. It was perfect to be occupied by land troops. And those they had. The dark elven general looked down at the rows and rows of undead. A well-constructed military made of all kind of zombies and skeleton in the lower ranks, stronger undead like death knights and vampires as commanders, and a ton of necromancers and liches in the rear. Argot Noer, the kingdom in darkness and moonlight. The sole empire encompassing an undead world, led by the immortal god King Persa. Their access to the Pathworks was a story of success. They did not need land to grow a new populace. They could just revive the dead of the destroyed worlds and grow their power. They took in the living who were willing, and if they were not, in death they were. The path they had chosen would lead to the northwestern corner of the continent of Earth. The information they had gotten from the Church of the System describes this place as the center of undead activity. This was why the biggest delegation of more than 100,000 undead had been sent here. Everyone here had already been dead before the Pathworks were even opened. It was perfect to grow their troops before continuing to pacify this land from the northwest, before meeting up with the smaller groups across the continent. Even better, as the center of undead there would be a lot of wild undead. The information had talked about the zombies being the result of a parasitic virus, whatever that even meant. Undead were undead. This meant necromancers would not have to spend mana on raising them, just taming them. When the priest was finally done with his fanatical speech, the troops were allowed to enter the Pathworks. The entrance was a gigantic dark hole that was just existing in midair, like a gap in the fabric of space. Wind, sound, light, and people. Anything vanished, as if sinking into a pool of the darkest, blackest ink one could find. It was not his first time leading his troops into another world, but you would never get used to the feeling of slowly being submerged into a liquid and then sucked in and flung around, as if you entered a current. What came into view after leaving the portal on the other side was a wide plaza surrounded by high-rising buildings and streets that reminded him of canyons with the straight fronts of skyscrapers bordering them. Leaving the portal that was stretching across the plaza were orderly rows and rows of disciplined undead foot soldiers, all decked in the same dark, rusty, lightweight armors. In front of them, seated on skeleton horses, rode the other generals like him. They gave commands to get into formation, and horns were blown as the troops gathered together on the plaza. They set up camp for the living and sentient members of the army. One might think that in an undead world, everyone is supposed to be an undead. But that's not how it was. There were many living among the commanders and necromancers, like him. It was unavoidable. You can't have an empire when almost all your subject are brainless, drooling sacks of rotting meat. After camp was set up, they sent out teams of soldiers and necromancers to collect the wild undead in this megacity and bolster their troops. It was night right now, and they would be back at sunrise so the undead would not be damaged by the sunlight. But nobody came back at sunrise. The remaining necromancers and liches created a canopy of darkness above the camp to shield the army from the sun. The generals and commander met and decided to wait a little longer. Several hours passed, but there were no signs of the missing teams. This was not supposed to happen. There should have been nothing that could endanger them in this town. So what happened? After waiting this long without any clues, the generals and the commander had a meeting and decided to send scout teams consisting of dark elves, since the undead were not fit to move during the day. The generals waited again. The sun was setting again. But nobody returned again. When sun had set, the generals had decided. Sending small numbers and teams was obviously not working, so they split up the army. Each one took about half of their men and would scout in a different direction, while the other half would stay with the army commander in the plaza. The dark elven general led an army of about 8,000 men, of which more than 1,500 were dark elves while the rest were a mix of different undead. They slowly wandered into the dark and foreboding street canyons. Few cars filled the otherwise empty streets, and the black, empty windows were staring at the silently moving army. He could feel the gaze of these windows. Something was there. It did not take long. As he was watching, he saw pale figures scramble out of those empty windows and crawl down the walls like four-legged spiders. Deformed humanoid figures with eyes and lumps of meat growing on all kinds of places, and limbs moving in unnatural angles, and some with a few too many limbs and extremities growing from unusual places. Others had eyeless faces or lacked a nose, but sported split jaws filled rows and rows of terrifying teeth. The general shuddered at the sight of such atrocities. He had seen the creations of some crazy necromancers, but this and these numbers were too much for him. It was just incomprehensible. Just what was wrong with this world? But the worst was yet to come. From the entrances to the sides came similar, but less distorted creatures wearing shreds and pieces of dark robes and armor. This was what was left of their teams and scouts. Before he could even comprehend what was going on, the pale creatures attacked. With incredible power, they jumped off the walls on either side of the street and crashed into the undead army. This was a bona fide ambush. The dark elf watched as the creatures easily dispatched his troops. They did not just rip and tear the skeletons like paper cutouts, they even hunted his soldiers. They easily entered their ranks, killed a few, and would snatch a living, a dark elf or a necromancer, or even a zombie. Tongues like tentacles would strangle the living and long armor-piercing claws snatch the dead. Then they would return to the buildings with a mighty jump carrying their prey. Even though his soldiers fought back valiantly, their weapons could barely hurt these monsters. And they were just too fast for the necromancers to use their magic against them. Only few creatures fell to the undead troops. The dark elves were better off. They could keep up with the monsters and take a few with them before they finally fell. It did not improve their situation. The blood of the beasts was viscous and dulled their blades. Sickening odors broke from their dead bodies when they finally stopped moving. To make it all worse, they were vastly outnumbered. Before the general could react and call for a retreat, they had already been surrounded by an overwhelming sea of creatures. There was no way out. He could dispatch them in a fair fight, but their overwhelming numbers pressured him. He could only fight for his life and watch his men be wiped out one by one. Whatever these creatures were, they were not zombies as they knew them. Shouting and hacking, he finally managed to gather his last troops to break out of the encirclement. Rushing back to the main army was their only chance now. Their last hope was crushed. When the small group of survivors finally reached the plaza, after many losses and sacrifices, everything was already gone. The troops that had stayed behind had been annihilated. All they ran into was an army of monsters feasting on the remains of their comrades. Not only that, some of these creatures were even entering the pathworks. It was then that the creatures behind them caught up and the dark elven general realized the true danger. Among the beasts chasing them, new ones had appeared. It was a tattoo that revealed the terrifying fact. One of the creature had a tribal tattoo he knew from one of his ghoul soldiers. It wasn't just the living who had turned. Even the undead could turn into these beasts. It's just a pathetic world without magic. If it's undead, we can just count them to our troops. We were truly arrogant in our ignorance. This world is way too frightening and dangerous. Looking at his men, they all knew they were the last stragglers of a wiped-out army. They were doomed. However, there was still one thing they had to do. He rallied his remaining men, and they made one final charge toward the portal. They had to close the gate and hinder these creatures from entering their world. It was afternoon when Seth finally opened his eyes. He had slept like a log and had been completely exhausted. What actually woke him up was his stomach rumbling. So much happened, he could not remember the last time he had rationed his food. Good thing he had saved his backpack. It was a little burned on the outside, but inside was most of the food he had bought in Starda. Seth gorged on the jerky and bread until he was full. This is a lot better, he sighed, and stood up. He rearranged his inventory to place all the food he had in there. He had learned his lesson and didn't want to risk losing it. Judging from the lack of search parties, the undead probably thought he had died in the fire. Checking himself, he realized that he had actually not gotten any damage at all. His clothes, on the other hand, were done for. Even the little armor value they had was gone, as the durability had fallen to 0. They were so burned and ripped, he could only throw them away now. Status. Name: Seth Smith. Title: Faster Than the Thought. Level: 8. EXP: 27%. Race: Orihuma. Sex: male. Age: 23. Class: Spirit Blacksmith Unique. Affiliation: none. Health: 1000 of 1000. Mana: 120. Strength: 15. Dexterity: 17. Agility: 20. Intelligence: 12. Willpower: 14. Endurance: 18. Personality: 8. Luck: 15. Free AP. Attribute points: 50. Free SP. Skill points: 4. Defense. Physical: 104, 54 plus 50. Yendix 3. Magical: 53, 28 plus 25. WILX 2. Fire resistance: 100%, 50% plus 50%. Skill window: Calm reaction, passive, LV5. Blacksmith beginner, LV8, 51%. Blacksmith's eyes, LV2. Smelting beginner, LV7, 11%. Blueprint beginner, LV2. Weapon mastery beginner, LV8, 50%. Spirit smithy, LV2. Spirit capture, LV2. Map, LV1. Fear resistance, LV5. Fire affinity, LV5. Soul infusion, LV1. Observation, LV2. Concealment, LV2. He had leveled up. And so did many of his skills, with weapon mastery leading the way. Also, his fire affinity had leveled up. This explained why he took no damage in the fire. His resistance had actually grown to 100%. It was great that his skills were growing, but his blacksmith skills were falling behind. It was high time he got himself a hideout to grind his skills. With the resources in the city, he was sure he could grind his skills to mastery. With this thought, he made his way out of the highly barricaded room. But when he shoved a dresser out of his way, it fell over and scattered its contents all over the floor. His eyes fell on a pile of jewelry that fell out of a small chest. He was able to pay with iron ingots in Starta Village, so would their empire also be interested in precious metals? Smelting gold would also level up his skill, so he didn't lose anything by trying, right? He put the jewelry in his dilapidated backpack and left the apartment. He saw the same zombies as the night before when he sneaked down the stairs. They had not increased since then, so that undead must have gone somewhere else. He decided to dispatch these stragglers. Better be safe than sorry. The zombies were not very hard opponents if you sneaked up on them. They were generic zombies, so Seth easily got rid of them with his billhook. Collecting some experience and proficiency on the go was nice. Fighting felt a lot more comfortable now. The city was empty during the day, and he could freely walk on the street, but he could feel the stares of the zombies from the shadows in the ruins and windows. But it felt like there were a lot less than the day before. He had no explanation, just a hunch. While he was looking around the city, he could not withstand the seduction of the rebars sticking out like broken bones from the concrete ruins that made up a lot of the scenery. Seth only needed an hour to fill a full stack of 99 rebars in his inventory space. Now he also knew the maximum size of stacks. Seth followed the trail of destruction in reverse. The outskirts were still in rubble and barely reconstructed, but the closer Seth wandered to the city center, the better, and knew the buildings looked. Reconstruction must have started here. But with the better environment came more gore. Most people in the city must have lived here. The streets were painted in dried blood and filled with broken glass from windows and doors. He could see signs of fighting. Broken pieces of weapons and armor were visible here and there, but Blacksmith's eyes told him that they had all been low-grade stuff. Oddly enough, he felt no stares anymore. There were no zombies far and wide, nor did he meet any other monsters. What happened? There was blood all over the place, but no monsters. Did they hide? Migrate maybe? It surely was his fortune that there were no zombies, but it was terribly suspicious. Was there something even more terrifying here? And where did that giant army of undead go? He checked the apartment buildings and skyscrapers to the sides of the roads, but except the gut-wrenching sets for zombie movies, he found nothing. Of course, he used the chance to loot food and also some jewelry. Seth had reached his destination, so he could take his time for the good side of apocalypse life, freely robbing anything he needed or that caught his interest. When he reached the roof of an apartment building, he was just done checking. He sat down to count his spoils. Looking at the food he found assured him that he would not have to return to Starda as often as he had expected. Settling down here somewhere in the center would not be a bad idea, if not for the weird disappearance of all those undead. He had a good view from this roof. Seth pulled out his father's binoculars to get an overview of the city. This was when he had noticed a small cloud of unnatural black fog above the center plaza of Deltan. It was shrinking at a visible rate. Seth wanted to look at the plaza, but he couldn't see it as other buildings were in the way. Whatever weird thing was going on in the center was probably connected to the missing mobs. He could only look for a better vantage point to find out what was going on. He had to know, to decide whether he would stay here or look for a different neighborhood. Seth decided on a high-rise closer to the center. He climbed the 15 floors worth of stair with a sour expression. The elevator worked, but on the other hand, he didn't want to get stuck in there with no one around.
Ding.
Thanks to continuous training you have gained. Yendi +1. Fu *K. He cursed as he breathlessly flopped down after reaching the roof. He had actually gained endurance by walking stairs. He scrambled onto his feet and looked towards the center. Seth could see the black fog with his bare eyes, but it had almost vanished. Taking the binoculars from the inventory again, he looked at the center plaza. What he saw was a camp made of big dark tents filling the center plaza and a giant black membrane occupying a whole side of the plaza. It was Gate. How did he know? Because he actually observed the undead vanishing into the darkness, as if they were swallowed by a tar pit. Seth was actually quite lucky, so see this. Almost all undead were gone from the plaza. He was just in time to see the rear guard vanishing into the portal before it closed. This has to be the pathworks the priest mentioned. But why did they leave? Seth mused, still watching the now empty camp. He didn't believe it was because of what he did yesterday. Whoever these people were, they had slaughtered everyone in the city center and probably collected them as undead. The few zombies he killed that night would barely make a dent in their army. Seth sat down and ate while he kept an eye on the camp. After an hour, Seth was more or less sure that they were gone for good. Seth guessed that he had not encountered any zombies since he entered the city center, because they probably collected them all and left. So this part of Deltan was technically safe now. Whatever their reason to leave was, it probably wasn't a danger here. I guess I will stay here then, Seth decided happily. Deltan was now his base. After Seth was convinced that the undead army wasn't coming back anytime soon, he decided to inspect their camp. Maybe they left some supplies for him? It was around noon, and the sun stood high in the sky. The fog had vanished, so Seth didn't worry too much about the undead as he visited the camp at the central plaza. It was a group of big tents, like you would sometimes see in historical movies. They were made of thick black canvas-like cloth. It was heavy and rough to the touch, but it was darker than any cloth he had ever seen. The insides were pitch black. Seth had to affix the flap to stay open, so light could fall in. The interior had rich decorations, and the floor was covered in fine carpets. This must have been the tent of someone with a high rank. There was a soft-looking bed, a table, and a big, well-made chest. Were they in a hurry? Seth asked when he looked at a bottle and half-filled goblet on the table. The contents reminded him a little of wine, but the smell definitely didn't. Unfortunately, the chest only contained spare clothes. As terrible as his current clothes looked, he would never wear something as frilly and pompous as the stuff he found in there. Even his hopes that they might be enchanted were dashed by blacksmith's eyes. Just ordinary ugly clothes. Most tents were like that. These people were really stingy. Couldn't they have left something good for a poor young man trying to make a living in the apocalypse? Most of the tents looked the same level of luxurious, but none actually contained anything helpful. All he could do was collect the tent's tarp. They seemed very sturdy. Maybe they came in handy later. But Seth didn't give up. He would thoroughly loot search all the tents. It actually happened as he was wandering in between the tents that he heard the jingle of metal. When he looked down, he saw the glinting of a ring he had kicked with his foot. Did someone lose it? It was a simple, smooth silver ring. He picked it up and appraised it with blacksmith's eyes. Worst case, it was just a crafting material, but magic ring. Uncommon. Durability. 12 of 20. 1. Increases mana by 2%. 2. Increases intelligence by 5. A mass-produced magical ring worn by low-ranking members Argot Noah's army. It was actually an item with stats. Although the options looked unremarkable, beggars can't be choosers. Seth had nothing, and now he had something. And having 50 points more mana lifted his mood tremendously. Seth's mood fell again when the ring stayed the only useful thing he found in the camp. There were no food supplies he was willing to trust and not a glimpse of equipment. He could only sigh and move on. Time spent looting was time well spent, but he had to decide on a place where he could hole up and grind his skills. A base. Looking around, the buildings surrounding the central plaza were no very good options. Ignoring the fact that the gate could open again at any time, the structures around here were very open public buildings or shopping malls. All of them sported a very fashionable shattered glass front door. Most buildings were wearing it this year. Worst thing was that they had all looked like they had already been ransacked. Seth had to go and look for something sturdy for his base. Something he could defend. In the evening, he finally came to a neighborhood he liked. In the end, he chose one of those apartment houses similar to the one he had hidden in last night, with sturdy wooden doors at the entrance and barred windows on the ground floors. It was close enough to the city center to have no zombies around, but not too close, so he had time to get away if the pathworks opened again. Looking around the entrance hall, he found a bundle of spare keys at the janitor's place and locked the front door behind him. With a securely locked door between him and the world, a weight finally fell off Seth's shoulders he had not noticed before. He leaned his back against the reassuringly thick wooden door and slid to the ground. For some time, Seth just sat there on the ground and enjoyed the silence and chill form the floor tiles. This might have been the first time he actually relaxed since the apocalypse started. After a good while, he stood up and inspected the door. Should I reinforce it? No. It should be enough for today, Seth decided. He went up the stairs to see which place would become his new home. Regrettably, most of the potential homes were drenched in blood and filled with the stench of death. Not really places he wanted to live in. They were still places he wanted to loot, so his luggage kept growing. He kept going up the stairs until he reached the rooftop. Then he went back down and inspected the first floor again. He had noticed something weird. After some looking around a little, he actually found a private elevator. Seth knew there was something wrong with the last staircase. There had been no doors for the floor right below the roof. This elevator probably led to a private suite. But he could trust the elevator. So he used the maintenance ladder to climb up. This reminded him that ladders also really weren't his thing, especially not with a big sack of foods he had to tow up with him. At the end of the ladder, he really found the elevator doors to a suite. The whole upper floor was one big clean apartment with high ceilings, wide hallways, and big rooms. It was just perf. Warg, the previous owner, asserted his claim over this living space. It was the zombie of an old man who probably could not leave because, let's be honest, regular zombies are too dumb to use an elevator, even if it works. Seth ended his preposterous claims with a quick swipe of the billhook. Some corpse pulling, and a kick later, he had delivered the man, who returned to the afterlife, out of a window and onto the street with a splat. The whole upper floor was one big clean apartment with high ceilings, wide hallways, and big rooms. No previous owners. Yes, this place was just perfect. Since he had chosen this place as his new permanent home, Seth started to unload the food from his inventory and the backpack into the kitchen. It was a very big and modern kitchen with countertops made of marble and all the appliances with stainless steel. It was as if someone took it straight out of a catalog. It actually held a big surprise for him. The cabinets were well filled with non-perishable goods, and the fridge was filled to the brim. 2. Deltan's power grid was still working, so the things were still edible. How lucky! Seth was so happy that he cooked up a feast to enjoy. There really was more food left in the world than he had thought. After filling his belly to his heart's content, he stumbled into the bedroom and enjoyed the soft embrace of a high-quality bed.
Ah, yes.
I am home, he mumbled and fell asleep.